Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Stavros Lambrinidis, and the Atlantic Council President and CEO, Fred Kemp.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Atlantic Council, to those joining us here in person at our headquarters in Washington, and hello to those joining us from around the world. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2023 EU-U.S. Defense and Future Forum, hosted in partnership with the delegation of the European Union to the United States. I'm joined this afternoon by my friend and colleague, Ambassador of the European Union, Stavros Lambrinidis, whose days here in Washington are sadly now short, just before he takes on his new role, and this is the good part, as EU Ambassador to the UN, so we'll still be very close to him. He's been a force for good here, a terrific force for good, effective champion for strategic relations, and he really has been instrumental in giving the US-EU relationship a greater strategic quality and ambition.
Wow, thank you, Fred. Much appreciated. And you know, I'm not just saying this. Your leadership on transatlantic affairs, your friendship to me and to the EU delegation from day one has been instrumental in kickstarting again this relationship in the past few years. So thank you. Now, it's particularly a great pleasure for me to be back here with Fred for this year's Defense and Future Forum. This is a flagship convening of leaders and stakeholders in dialogue to develop a forward-looking transatlantic agenda. It has been such a pleasure to keep up the partnership with the Atlantic Council that showcases the breadth and the depth of the transatlantic relationship in action. And proof positive of that is that this is the third edition of a forum. It's building off on 2021's inaugural EU-U.S. Future Forum and last year's Defense and Future Forum. You noted we added the word defense to highlight how our defense cooperation is making a huge difference in the world as well. But this year is still another first. We are hosting the forum right here at the Atlantic Council for the first time with an in-person audience and also streaming to a virtual audience on both sides of the Atlantic and around the globe.
Exactly right, Mr. Ambassador, dear Stavros. When we first hosted the forum, we transformed this room into a studio, but we couldn't really have anyone here except for the two of us and camera people and a few other lookers on. But this year we transformed the room again for this in-person convening, but we didn't let go of what we learned during the period of COVID, which is we could reach tens of thousands of people virtually. I can't think of any better reason to meet in person than for a discussion on the transatlantic partnership and the EU-U.S. relationship. This is a topic that's central to our mission and ethos at the Atlantic Council that has guided the Atlantic Council's work across each of our 16 programs and centers over 60 years. So we have an Africa Center, Mideast Center, but we're working with Europe across all of our various centers, Geotech Center, Geoeconomic Center. So we have a Europe Center, and that's what's hosting this gathering today, but we're working with Europe across everything else. And we've been working tirelessly with our EU colleagues to plan this year's forum. We'll miss you, Mr. Ambassador, although I think you're going to see a lot of us in New York. But we're going to miss your daily dedication in D.C. to strengthening transatlantic partnership. But I'm thrilled we have this forum created from our shared vision to create this, to keep your legacy in Washington alive.
Thank you. You remember when we first hatched the idea, it was, I think we were both wearing penguin suits at some event.
Some black tie event.
That was not a bad event, but we were both kind of bored. And then we started talking about, hey, how can we make this exciting again?
Yeah, so that just shows you should always attend these events, and if they get boring, talk to the person next to you and do some business.
Well, look, but we thought, and we were absolutely right, that we had to find a way to kickstart the resurgence of the EU-U.S. relationship. And I can tell you that back then, neither of us or anyone else had the idea of just how central this relationship would become in the years to follow. It's now been, dear friends, over a year and a half since Russia's entirely unprovoked, illegal, deeply brutal invasion of Ukraine, a stark reminder of just what is at stake for the transatlantic relationship. Russia's attack against the people of Ukraine is an attack against the values of Europeans and Americans alike, and an affront to the entire European peace project. But it is also, I emphasize this, it's also an open attack on the UN Charter and its principles, and the cause of a food and an energy crisis that affect the interests and the values of every country in the world, every country that believes in the sovereignty of independent nations to decide their future free of neocolonialist aggression and the threat of war. Since the start of the war, the EU and our member states have made available close to $89 billion in financial, military, humanitarian, and refugee assistance, with this increasing on a daily basis. The heroes of Ukraine have withstood the brutal onslaught of Russia's revisionist aggression because of this joint, massive European and American support, and it has to continue. If this war ends quickly, it's because Putin will know that he cannot outlast us. And for that to happen, we must be dedicated on both sides of the Atlantic of giving the support Ukraine needs for the long term to counter his violence. We have decoupled in Europe our reliance on sources of Russian energy as well. And very soon the EU will approve the 12th package of massive sanctions against Russia. Most important, we continue to provide Ukraine in the midst of this war with the assistance it needs to survive and to thrive as a future member of the European family. Fred, a few days ago, I know you know this, I don't know how many in the audience know this, was the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was in 1989. Since then, Europe has become immeasurably freer, stronger, bigger, and more united. We've learned one lesson as Europeans: brutality and repression are not inevitable, and they are not values. They are a cancer. We Europeans beat that cancer. Others can too.
I am so glad, Mr. Ambassador, that you've underscored with your comments the strategic value of this EU-U.S. relationship. Perhaps we needed a Ukraine crisis to really drive this home to us, but no one can deny it any longer, and it was that way even before the crisis, and it will grow in nature and strategic nature going forward. The transatlantic partnership also extends past the shores of Europe. As President Biden said in his recent address to the American people, we are an inflection point. Russia's war in Ukraine, the horrific attacks by Hamas on Israel, an increasingly confrontational China, these all threaten the peace, security, and values that for so long have centered the transatlantic partnership and our collective prosperity. And I should note that U.S. and European leaders are singing from the same sheet. Indeed, on the same night that President Biden delivered his powerful address from the Oval Office, both President von der Leyen and President Michel were in Washington, and President von der Leyen delivered her blockbuster speech about Europe's future at this inflection point and her vision for a geopolitical union, which is music to the ears of dedicated transatlanticists on both sides of the Atlantic. So we should not dismiss the convergence of the timing of these two speeches. They came on the same day. They came blocks away from each other, and we are more deeply understanding we're facing these shared challenges together, and we dare not lose sight of that.
Fred, you're absolutely right. And at the heart of this transatlantic relationship has been EU-U.S. cooperation. Together we stand up to bullies around the world, and we will stand up for our partners and allies. This is our promise. But, friends, the transatlantic relationship is also, if not primarily based on bilateral ties, it's a collective strength on the day-to-day that allows us to be strong and united in the world when crises blow up. Through our cooperation, we are showcasing the talents of our people and our societies, and we build our economies and industries to take on generation-defining challenges, like climate change. We also strive to take advantage of opportunities like the rapid advance of AI, while simultaneously addressing their potential serious risks. All of these things we do together, and we are able to respond more quickly, more robustly, because of the deep interlinkages between our people, our societies, and our governments. The Trade and Technology Council, for example, has been a mainstay to align our efforts to shape the future of a global technology policy, and even served as a launching pad for our rapid response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Simply put, we are stronger together.
But we aren't blind to the threats to our unity either. Since the transatlantic relationship's inception, we've navigated policy and philosophical differences. But our shared ability to negotiate and disprove the so often foretold demise of the transatlantic partnership is proof in and of itself of the strength of our unity. Last year, we asked ourselves, how can we stop challengers from chipping away at the cornerstones of our liberal values? How can we proactively respond to the challenges we face? Those questions are still very much relevant a year and a half later. To answer these tough questions, we will have 2 action-packed days of conversations, debates, and discussions with dozens of EU leaders, experts, and officials, along with their U.S. counterparts, to explore the most important and enduring elements of the U.S.-EU relationship.
We will hear from leaders from our member states of the European Union, including a conversation with the Secretary General of the European External Action Service, Stefano Sannino. And later this afternoon, we will have the honor to meet and discuss with the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas. And to our in-person audience, join us right here at the Atlantic Council this evening for a reception as we pay tribute to veterans together around, of course, Veterans Day.
And tomorrow, we'll start with a conversation on economic security with the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Commerce, Don Graves, before we dive into our defense cooperation and counterterrorism efforts, our shared vision for climate diplomacy and development investment, and also to help meet the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and more. This promises to be a stellar discussion from start to finish, and I encourage everyone to engage in person, online, or via social media. And join in the conversation on social media using the hashtag EUDFF23.
Wait a second. Did you guys take note? You write it down? Because we say those things and no one writes it down, and then they don't.
Let's
right.
get those pens out. Sorry,
EUDFF
not the pens. That's old
23.
school. Yeah, EUDFF23 hashtag in front of that. For our virtual audience, please do make sure to ask questions to our speakers. For those joining us in person, we'll be ready to call on you for your questions. And as a reminder, you can still register for the event at atlanticcouncil.org. There you will find a complete agenda with live streams, detailed speaker information, and all the forum's various announcements.
Thank you. Thank you again to everyone for joining us. Fred, thank you for your friendship. I will dearly miss you. But as you said, perhaps not too far away. New York is not a bad town.
It's okay.
So maybe you can visit there as well. So with that, it's time to turn to our first discussion, a conversation with the Secretary General of the External Action Service, Stefano Sannino, moderated by the Wall Street Journal's Vivian Salama.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's so great to be back at the Atlantic Council. Always a pleasure, and definitely a pleasure to join you all for my second U.S.-EU Defense Forum. It is my privilege to be joined here, unfortunately not in person, but virtually all the same, with Stefano Sannino, the Secretary General of the European External Action Service, which for those not familiar is the diplomatic service and combined foreign defense ministry of the European Union. So Secretary General, it's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you very much, Vivian. It's very good to see you, and I'm sorry not to be there. I was hoping to be able to join you physically in Washington, but unfortunately, the present circumstances and the quite messy situation of the world are not really helping me to do that. But I'm very happy.
Few things.
Yeah.
There are just a few things going on in the world. I really understand that you've been tied up. I want to dive in. We don't have much time, and so we really want to dive in to talk about some of these geopolitical challenges. Some of the things that are Brussels at the moment. See the Ukraine war, the rise, which have changed EU's approach to globally. including its partnerships with the U.S.
Yeah.
Is this better now? Great.
Much better, thank you.
Oh, excellent. Oh, I'm glad. We really want to hear you address how the EU has been addressing some of these major challenges and crises in the world right now, from the war in Ukraine to the rise of China. Certainly the Middle East now is flaring up again. And also how it's impacted or changed the way you approach your relationships like that with the U.S.
Yeah, thank you very much. And allow me just with 1 minute to thank Frederick for hosting this, co-hosting with Stavros. And a huge thanks to Stavros that has been instrumental in making the relationship between the EU and the United States as good as it is today. So really huge thanks and glad that he can continue to work on another perspective with us. On the situation that we are going through, I think that unfortunately, I don't need to say too much because it's under the eyes of everybody. But it is true that if there is one thing that we have learned during this complex period, is that the working together, the United States and the European Union can make the difference, and have been able to have a real impact on the situation in Ukraine and in vis-a-vis Russia. And as Stavros was saying, this brutal aggression of Russia against Ukraine. So this has been, I think, a very important element of what we are managing to do. And it has been, in a way, if I may say so, also discovery for the European Union, because all of a sudden we have realized that we could play a very significant role also in areas where we were not accustomed. For a long time, the European Union has been known for its soft power, for the Brussels effect, our normative and standards powers. But then, I mean, we have become more and more also a hard power, using the means at our disposal to ensure security in the world, or at least helping creating the conditions for this to happen. We have done through a number of instruments that we have developed, but I think that what is particularly relevant is the possibility of financing directly lethal equipment, our capacity to support the Ukrainian army, to train its army. And this has become, again, a very important feature. And we are now very much involved into the work on providing also security commitments to Ukraine. So I think that this partnership has been very strong with the United States. It has also been very strong with NATO. I don't want to forget mentioning this dimension where all the allies come together. And this is a dimension that we are developing broadly with the other countries in the world. And we want to make it sure that, again, we can become an actor for stability and security all over the world.
I definitely want to dive deeper into some of the issues that you just touched upon, but certainly the war in Ukraine has presented enormous challenges for your bloc since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Obviously, it's dominated our conversations here in Washington and my appearances here, certainly at the Atlantic Council. Now we're just a few short months away from the third anniversary of this conflict, and there are growing concerns that we are either already at a stalemate in Ukraine or heading that way. Is that your assessment?
No, I mean, I think that it's we cannot say that. There is certainly a very difficult situation on the ground. I'm not hiding the fact that we were hoping to see more development also during this summer, during the counteroffensive. But we cannot underestimate what the Ukrainian forces have managed to do to recuperate large chunks of the territory that Russia had occupied illegally. country, and to give a sense that the Russian army and the Russian war machine was not prevailing in Ukraine. So we need to continue to have confidence in what we are doing and the support that we are giving to Ukraine. As the High Representative Borrell is often saying, we need to do more and we need to do more rapidly. And that's the lessons that we are trying to learn. We will continue and have committed to continuing supporting Ukraine in this endeavor. It has been said, but I think it's a real truth, especially seen from this side of the Atlantic, that Ukrainians are fighting a fight for all of us, fighting this fight for democracy, for the defense of the right of free people, and for being willing to resist this neo-colonialist occupation that Russia is trying to impose on Ukraine.
That being said, pardon me.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, Mr. Secretary General, sustaining this level of support, then, if this conflict were to drag on for quite some time, which is the assessment here in Washington, certainly, and around the world, how then can members of the EU, the U.S., and others maintain that support, especially with constituents where politically it is becoming more of a divisive issue to support Ukraine in the long term? How then do you convince your constituents, certainly in member states in the EU, that this is the way to go?
I think, honestly, this has not become divisive in Europe at all. I mean, we are still very much united in the idea that this support is important, it's essential, and we have keep on repeating it for more than 2 years, almost 2 years now. So it's I don't have a sense, I don't have a feeling from the discussion and of the leaders at the European Council that this is going to be the case. And once again, I mean, when you are in the middle of the of your race, you don't ask whether you have to conclude it or not. I mean, you just go ahead because there is no alternative.
Well, interesting that you say that. Then are you confident that EU member states, and namely Hungary, which has said that it does not plan, that it could veto a proposed 50 billion euro package to Ukraine, do you feel that you will somehow get that funding for Ukraine, even if Hungary does not support?
I have not had the feeling from the discussion that we have had that there is any decision to stop this important package. On the contrary, I mean, if there is one, and you really appreciate it, we are in the middle of a revision of our budget, of a 7 years budget. And if there is one area where everybody agrees upon is the continuation of the assistance to Ukraine. Many other things are questioned, but this one is not questioned at all. So I'm more than confident that this will happen.
What about then the question of Ukrainian membership in the EU? Obviously, steps were taken last week to advance that potential bid. Again, Viktor Orban came out and said that Ukraine is in no way ready for it. And he holds a very powerful veto power in this regard. And so what are those conversations like, if you can share with us sort of those efforts to integrate Ukraine into the EU, and what are the potential of maybe some pushback among member states?
First of all, I mean, I think that we need to go at the report that has been put on the table of the European Council, of the member states, where there is a very positive assessment of the work that has been done by Ukraine over this difficult period. And I want to stress that this is done during a war, which is something which is honestly to be commended in the strongest possible way. There are still some elements that are identified in this report where the Ukraine needs to complete the work. I think that are very limited, very specific, and that can be done in a very limited amount of time. I cannot prejudge the outcome of the discussion that the leaders will have in December on this report. But what I can say is again that there was a very positive reception of the recommendations coming from the European Commission to the member states. And there is also a clear sense that the work will need to be completed in the months to come. There is a rendezvous clause for March next year, where we should be able to see if all the work has been completed, which gives ample time to work on these elements. So once again, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that there is a problem there. I mean, I see a lot of goodwill, a lot of support around the table, and we will build on that.
Thank you for that, Mr. Secretary General. Certainly, we could spend our entire time together talking about the crisis in Ukraine, but another crisis, the war between Israel and Hamas, is obviously dominating not only headlines in my industry, but the minds of a lot of policymakers as well. And so, can you talk us through a little bit how the EU, together with partners like the U.S., are looking to promote stability and security, particularly as the destruction of Gaza continues and concerns over Israel's security also continues so long as Hamas is in existence, essentially?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately we are in front of one of the worst crises because there is no easy solution and there is no easy way out. I think that it is fair to start with the brutal attack on the 7th of October and what the Hamas did on purpose to innocent people, not only killing, raping, doing the horrible things that unfortunately we have seen, but also then taking hostages back in Gaza. So I think that we have now to really be very much focused on how to solve this difficult element of the hostage crisis, which is very much at the heart also of the complexity of the action that we are seeing now. As I'm saying this, I'm also saying that the terrible bombardments and what is in Gaza and what is happening in the civilian structures in hospitals and in urban centers is extremely sad. It's terrible from many points of view. Once again, I mean, we need to see also how Hamas has infiltrated these complexes and how it's used hospitals and civil structures to hide himself. So I'm afraid that I do not have any kind of easy answer, and I mean, nobody has it. We will need to keep on working hard together to make it sure, first of all, that humanitarian assistance can flow into Gaza in substantial quantity, that can reach the people, the civilian population in particular. We will need to continue talking to our Israeli friends, telling them that they need to be careful about the way they are using the force and the way they are trying to restore the security of their own country. And we need to keep on working on the political solution that is very much needed at this stage. Maybe for too many years, and we have to make a sort of collective mea culpa. We have not been able to see the potential danger that would have come from Hamas. We have all considered it was weakened and that Israel had strength to deter it, which has not been the case. And again, we have put on the sort of in the back of our mind the need to work on a political solution. Now this is becoming an imperative. So we need to do many things at the same time to avoid regional escalation, which is very worrying for everybody. We need to make it sure that, again, the perspective of a Palestinian state becomes, again, a reality, because it's the only way to really win the hearts and minds of the Palestinian people.
And talk a little bit about that, a little more about that, sir, because I just got back from the region with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and this concept of what comes for Gaza after the conflict. Secretary Blinken asserting that we have to start talking about it now, even while this is a very live conflict. From your view, what is the future look like for Gaza, especially given the extent of the destruction and the level of distrust by leadership, even among Palestinians, for any kind of stability going forward?
As I said, there is a lot of work that needs to be done. We need to make it sure, first of all, that the Palestinian Authority could regain the trust and the confidence of the population, could be able to be perceived and seen as the leadership for all the parts of the Palestinian territory, so not only for the West Bank, but also for Gaza. And we will need to imagine a way to allowing this transition to happen. We will need to work on the element of security for the region, because once again, we do not want that Hamas could use again any sanctuary to continue its terrorist activity. We do not want that Gaza could be turned into a sanctuary for terrorists. But at the same time, we also need to make it sure that Palestine is a viable country, a viable state, and it can have a proper leadership that is running it in a way that is beneficial for its citizens. And we will need to support also the reconstruction of the country. But once again, we have to do it in a sustainable way, making it sure that the pillars on which this construction is going to be built are solid and are creating the conditions for the Palestinians to live in peace and security.
As we sit here in Washington, sections of the city are closed off because there are protests on the mall here, both in support of the people of Gaza and in support of Israel's right to defend itself. It's obviously been a very divisive issue. There are calls for ceasefires, there are calls for pauses, and Israel maintains that it will not do that without the hostages being released. From your vantage point, how are policymakers addressing this issue? Do you think that we are at a point where the fighting needs to stop, both for humanitarian reasons, but also just to sort of assess the situation, maybe give time for negotiations to continue with regard to the hostages?
Let me start saying maybe, and the reference that you've made about the manifestations in our cities is very relevant. Because somehow we are seeing now a sort of ideological divide. So we have almost a division of society between those who think that Israel is responsible of everything and those who believe that the Palestinians are responsible for everything. So, I mean, the sad truth is that the population are the victims and the first victims of what has happened. And this is something that needs to be said. And this is also should push us, especially should push our leaderships to focus much more on the element that we have in common and the work that we can do together. There is no point, to be honest, to go back to the responsibilities, go back in the years of what has happened. It is true, it's very sad, many mistakes have been made from all points of view, but we are where we are. And now I think that we have a sort of major responsibility to stop this terrible situation in which the civilian populations are being dragged in. So what we need to do is again to make it sure that and create the conditions for what you said, for having the possibility for our assistance to reach the most vulnerable segments of the society, of the population, to create the condition for the hostages to be released, create the conditions for a political process to start again. And that's has to be our objective. I mean, this is, I don't think that there is too much, let's say, reason to go into a sort of responsibility and blame game about who is more responsible for what is happening. We are in a very difficult situation. I think that we have more to make a collective effort to make sure that this is not lasting. And again, that especially the civilian populations are not suffering the consequences of this.
Thank you for that. I want to shift gears dramatically in the few minutes we have left and maybe even give time for a question from the audience. President Biden right now is in San Francisco along with many other world leaders for the APEC summit, and he will be meeting with China's President Xi Jinping. Here in Washington, what I hear from policymakers is there has been, I don't want to call it a total thaw, but maybe a little bit of an effort on both sides to repair some of the friction that was happening, especially in the spy balloon era earlier this year. Do you get the sense from where you're sitting that China is coming to the table with a sense of goodwill, that they are making an effort to cooperate with the West? Or would you say that tensions still continue on a number of the issues, whether it be on trade-related issues, espionage, whatever? I mean, there's a long list of complaints, certainly, that the West has unleashed. And so what is your assessment on sort of where Beijing stands and how it's approaching these relationships today?
Well, first of all, I would say that, I mean, we cannot mix everything together. I mean, trade is one story, security is another story, political dimension is a third one. So, I mean, we have to be careful about not, let's say, putting everything together. And our effort on the European side has been that of trying to identify ways and means to work with China in managing the complexity of this relationship. Let's be clear, I mean, China represents from all points of view an alternative model to our model. We have been for many decades being accustomed that that was the model, that our model was the model, everybody was buying it. And China is now challenging this in a very visible way. I think that at the basis of this, the need to manage this relationship, there is engagement. We need to engage. We need to be able to talk to China. We need to be able to find areas where we can work together. And I think that there are some. What is very often repeated is, for example, in the climate change, in the fight against climate change, there is a necessity to work together, and I think there is certainly also common interest to go in this direction. There are other areas where this is more difficult. You were mentioning trade. I mean, certainly in that area, we are competing with China. We, I'm saying, the United States or the European Union in different ways. And we need to ensure that in this competition, there is a level playing field, that China is not using, let's say, its intervention, it's the state intervention in the economy to create an unleveled playing field. So there, I mean, the competition, we have to be able to say it clearly to our Chinese counterparts. And then there is a third element, which is more the political aspect, where we have, as I was saying before, a sort of different way of approaching international relations, of approaching relations with third country, different way of looking at the division of development or the division of human rights. And in that case, then we need to be able to, let's say, prove also that we are able to be more effective and more efficient than they are. And that's where it's, I think it's the real challenge. And we will need to continue also telling China that there are a number of things that they could do that are detrimental not only for the stability in the region, but detrimental for the stability in the world. Thinking in particular to the stability of the Taiwan Straits, of the South China Sea, and where it is clear that we have an interest to avoid any situation that can create a negative impact on the region, but also on the free flow of our goods and our people. So again, a complex relationship, and I think that the meeting between President Biden and Chairman Xi is it's a very important moment to create these conditions for engagement. And we are doing the same on our side. At the beginning of December, we will have a summit between the European Union and China, and there will be another opportunity to continue again this engagement that has to be done with the eyes wide open.
I'll zoom out a little bit in some of the few minutes we have just to talk a little bit about U.S.-EU defense cooperation, particularly on issues like what we've just covered, whether it be the challenges posed by Russia or China, climate change you just mentioned. How is that cooperation going? Is there room for improvement? And if so, where? What would you like to see done to kind of really enhance that even further?
I hope that we can do more. I mean, we have started. We have taken a number of steps together, and trying to develop a concept which is good for both sides. And I hope that we can build on that. As you said, I mean, we have a number of challenges in the world, and if there is a lie of choice for us as the United States, and is what I hear also from our U.S. friends, that that the EU is also an ally of choice for the United States. And I hope that we can continue working in this way, and again building on this relationship. The component of security and defense is key from that point of view. What is needed in terms of security and stability in the world is immense in terms of resources, in terms of commitment, and in terms of engagement. And we need to join forces. And I mean, I don't think that there is any interest that we could have in trying to make a sort of race between us that can be advantageous only for those that are interested in working on our divisions and that are going against our unity.
What about, we just talked about countries, but what about U.S.-EU defense cooperation on areas like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, space? Any different approach or anything you could add?
No, I do not see any different approach. On the contrary, I see a lot of complementarity. We have a very constructive cooperation when it comes to cybersecurity. We have a very constructive work that we are starting developing when it comes to artificial intelligence. I mean, let's be clear. I mean, there is the concept, the political component. It's certainly the one that is bringing us together. Then there is also the industrial component, and we see that we are maybe competitors in some of these areas. But this does not mean that we cannot find ways of working together. And I would say even more, and again, now I'm speaking really on a personal point of view, on how we can manage to create the conditions for a larger market, which is a transatlantic market. I think that we are seeing a lot of needs materializing at the horizon, and we need to join forces, including to take care of these needs. So, I mean, I see if we want to, that's why I think that there are certainly margin for improvements, because I believe that a lot of work is still in front of us to create a really more substantial partnership in this area between the EU and US.
We have about 2 minutes left, and I'm hoping that we can get one quick question from the audience. If anyone has a burning question for the Secretary General, definitely want to give that opportunity for anyone here. There's a mic going around for anyone who wants to raise their hand and ask the Secretary General a question. Don't be shy. Well, I will take the privileges then, because we have a shy group here. So I will definitely ask you the next the last question, which is, as far as challenges moving forward. Obviously, we see the Middle East flaring up again. We have the crisis in Ukraine. Do you feel that going forward, policymakers, the U.S., the EU, NATO in general, has the bandwidth to address all of these problems, confront all these problems in an effective way?
I do not see the alternative. So we need to be able to face the challenges and to be up to the needs that our citizens, it's not first are asking from us, and then the security for our societies and the securities more in general for the world. So it's I think that we cannot have we don't have an alternative. We don't have a choice. We just need to be able to be up to the expectations of all our citizens.
It's a tough but honest note to end with. Secretary General Cenino, it's a pleasure talking to you. I hope you come visit us in Washington very soon. Thank you so much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, pardon, sorry.
I will come to Washington. I hope at the very beginning of 24. So it's already on the cards.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We have a 10-minute coffee break, and then I will be back with Estonia's Prime Minister. So just listen for the announcement. We'll see you in a few.
ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here. Last time I was here, it was in 2021, and we had a video thing. So there was like 5 people in the room because of COVID. You remember that crisis? Well, that seems like a long time ago. But first of all, I really want to thank you to the EU delegation and the Atlantic Council for organizing this EU-U.S. Defense and Future Forum. It is crucial to strengthen mutual understanding on both sides of the Atlantic, especially given the large-scale conventional war in Europe and conflict in the Middle East. Unfortunately, we live at the time when we need to focus yet again on conventional defense and deterrence. Russia wants to redraw the map of Europe, including by re-establishing spheres of influence and recreating buffer zones. Just imagine, in Ukraine, it occupies the area that would span over the state of Virginia or Tennessee. For peace in the Euro-Atlantic community, we need to know how to break the historical cycle of aggressions by Russia. Professor Timothy Snyder has rightly argued that in order for a country to become better, it must lose its last imperial war. The European Union came about because Europeans lost their colonial wars. Now it's Russia's turn. So it is not enough to say that Ukraine must win. Russia also has to lose. And this means being militarily defeated in Ukraine. Russia's regime remains confident that it has more resolve than we do. It still believes it is able to outlast Ukraine and the Euro-Atlantic community. Therefore, Russia is pursuing the objectives with a theory of victory that is essentially attritional. It thinks that it can wear Ukraine and also us down. The Russian military assesses that it can sustain losses for longer than Ukraine does. The Russian state is embarking on full mobilization of its defense industry. Its industry is aiming to outproduce the industrial base of the transatlantic community to wage a conventional war against Ukraine over a longer period. The lesson from Russian war against Ukraine show that mass and iron matter, and these can do a lot of harm. It helps to sustain a long war of attrition. Russians have understood that quantity of resources is quality, and as a result have stepped up production of ammunition and machinery. Recent events in the Middle East also highlight that despite highly technological advanced solutions, one can do a lot of harm with simple tools. You just need a 5-foot 1-inch ladder to overcome a 5-foot tall wall. Conventional warfare is not going to slowly fade away into a trash bin of history. By prolonging the conflict, Russia seeks to exhaust our will to support Ukraine. We know its playbook. We know that what Russia does when it can't win on the ground. It tries to freeze it, to get the pause so that it can rebuild and then come back even stronger. And then everything will continue in a much, much larger scale. The human suffering will continue as well as the atrocities. We shouldn't make that mistake again. In parallel, it continues a shadow war among all of us to undermine international support for Ukraine, be it in cyber, energy, information domains, or via migratory pressure and manipulating with global food security. By targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, Russia aims to cause painful civilian losses, migration surges, and social tensions. Their hope is eventually make Ukrainian people surrender by breaking their will and resolve to continue the fight, and shatter the support of the transatlantic community. It is not only the battlefield success that will decide the outcome of the war. we have to show Kremlin it cannot outlast Ukraine and the free world economically. So Ukraine's victory also depends on our ability to dry up the Kremlin's income to finance its aggression. We must speed up depleting Russia's war funds. Given all this, our strategy must be to stay firmly on the course and boost our long-term support to Ukraine. Our number one focus should be arms, ammunition, and training. They all must continue at the scale sufficient for Ukraine to win. The stronger Ukraine is, the sooner this tipping point will be reached. We in the free world are larger than the task, demonstrated by the sheer size of our collective political, economic, and military power. The combined defense budgets of the Ramstein coalition are more than 13 times bigger than that of Russia's heavily inflated one. The European Union GDP is over 7 times greater than Russia's. The military spending of EU member states is already nearly 3 times larger than that of Russia's. There should be no doubt who has the advantage to prevail. But belief in the victory is also a crucial prerequisite for success. Ukrainians believe in it, and we should also. Ladies and gentlemen, we tend to take our world for granted. As Robert Kagan has said, the world order is one of those things people don't think about until it's gone. I come from a generation that was born without freedom, and now we have it. I don't take it for granted. I understand freedom is something you have to fight and pay for. I'm very grateful to the United States for your military support to Ukraine. And of course, Europe must also have a central role in ensuring Ukraine's long-term security. We are on this track already in the EU. We are discussing how to step up our defense spending and our defense industrial base. And I hope that EU will soon seal the deal on long-term aid commitment to Ukraine. And in parallel, that is why I also keep calling on NATO's allies to invest at least 2% of their GDP on defense. Estonia is taking its obligations in NATO very seriously. We are raising our defense spending over 3% already next year and continuously strengthen our defense base. Ukraine's fight for its existence is also a fight for global freedom, democracy, and dignity. Russia's aggression inevitably carries a cost to our own societies, and it is a reminder that defending freedom has a price tag. That is why our military aid to Ukraine is more than 1% of our GDP, but letting aggression pay off would be with a much, much higher price. Thank you.
If you're just joining us here or virtually, my name is Vivian Salama from the Wall Street Journal. It's my honor to be joined by the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas. I cheated a little because we've gotten the privilege of getting to know each other a little bit. You speak so passionately about the need for action in the war, for the war in Ukraine, to support Ukraine against Russian aggression. What I learned yesterday is it's very personal for you. You talked to me a little bit about your mother yesterday and her experiences. Can you share a little bit of that?
Yeah, what we are seeing in Ukraine is a history book playing all over again in real time. So all the atrocities we see Russia committing in Ukraine are the same that our grandparents or parents lived through. So, in 1949, when we had also peace after the Second World War, we had mass deportations. I mean, my mother, yes, was deported to Siberia in a cattle wagon. They were 3 weeks in this. So traveling is not the word to use, but but they were deported to Siberia, so they left everything behind. I mean, everything was taken from them. We were lucky, I mean, my family, because everybody returned after 10 years in Siberia, whereas, you know, there were families that were not that lucky. And, you know, if you think that is exceptional, a story like this, then it isn't. So every Estonian family has a story like this. And now we are also seeing this for Ukraine, you know, deportation of children. We see all these things happening on the occupied territories, and that's why it really has a personal effect. I mean, I feel that I come from the lucky generation that didn't have freedom, and so we regained freedom, and so I understand that it is something that you fight for and you don't take it for granted. And that is why I also feel that we have the obligation to our grandparents, so that we pay the debt because they lost everything. So we try to do everything to help Ukrainians not lose their freedom.
The U.S. just geographically is isolated from much of the world, certainly from Europe, and that can be both a blessing and a curse in terms of just understanding some of these threats to national security. And when our policymakers try to convince the American people that the war in Ukraine is a threat to U.S. national security, sometimes that doesn't always resonate given how far away it is. So you've been here talking to lawmakers, talking to officials around the Capitol. How have you been trying to convey that message? Are you having any difficulty reaching those officials in your discussions?
I don't know. We'll see how that goes, because we have had a lot of meetings and we're going to have more as well. And I was asking, you know, after several meetings, our ambassador is like, excuse me, when are we meeting the skeptical ones? So far, because, you know, that has resonated what I've been saying. I mean, freedom as such is one of the basic principles of United States. This is something that, you know, the members of Congress that I've spoken to understand. Of course, the question is, what is it in it for you know, American who is living, you know, maybe never goes abroad. But I think, you know, what is at stake here is, you know, the fundamental functioning of the world. All the aggressors or would-be aggressors in the world are very carefully taking notes how this plays out. And if, you know, our response is not strong enough, like it wasn't in 2014 when Crimea was annexed, then what the aggressors, you know, learn is that it pays off. It pays off to, you know, wage a war of aggression because you walk away with more than you had before.
When you say if our response is not strong enough, what does that look like in practice? What is the end result that would really send that message that you're talking about?
The end result that would really send this message is, like I said, you know, quoting Timothy Snyder, you know, in order for a country to become better, it must lose its last colonial war. Russia has never lost its last colonial war. So it is not enough that Russia, you know, Ukraine wins, but also Russia loses. And that means that they are defeated on the battleground, and that means that they go back to their borders. If they walk away with more than they had before, then it pays off.
Absolutely. One of the other things that you've also spoken about very passionately is the need to integrate Ukraine further into the Euro-Atlantic community. That has been an effort. Certainly there have been moves in the last week. We just talked about it with Secretary General Sunino about trying to further along potential Ukrainian candidacy into EU. But throughout the discussions about this, and we can even go back to 2008, there's been concerns about everything from corruption to issues about whether or not the government is strong enough to be able to execute and kind of join the EU, whether its economy is strong enough, all these issues. What is your position in terms of whether or not it's feasible for Ukraine?
Yeah, I have thought about this a lot. I mean, when we were occupied by Soviet Union, then Soviet Union normalized corruption. It was okay to steal from the state because the state was the occupiers. It was not ours. So, you know, there's an entire museum dedicated for this in one of our islands to show how creative people were from, you know, stealing behind the state. But when we got our freedom, our country and our independence back, then it required the whole change of mindset of the people. It's not okay to steal from the state because that is taxpayers' money. That is our country. That is our taxpayers. So it required that change. Ukraine didn't have that in 1991 when we did it, but I feel that they have it now, because they are literally fighting for their country. And so it's like they have the will to, you know, root out corruption. And I really see the efforts there. I also see the efforts regarding the very strong reforms. And again, coming from our own experience, there's a certain, you know, opportunity window in the history where, you know, you have all the political forces like literally joining hands. It's like, okay, these are very painful reforms, but we are going to do them because it's for our prosperity, for our, you know, future. They are necessary. And I see Ukrainians have it now, where, you know, different political views have the will. And I think it's also to our benefit, because we all want them to be a more prosperous country. That requires rule of law, that requires, you know, rooting out corruption. And just to bring you one example from our own history, from 1991, when we restored our independence, to this day, our average salary has grown 45 times, and our average pension has grown 65 times. That means that we don't really need the help outside anymore, and we can help others. Why I'm saying this is that when, you know, people are afraid that we are going to support Ukraine forever, no, we have to, you know, support them to do the necessary reforms. They are a very innovative country, and if the economy functions, I mean, they can prosper on their own, and we can all benefit from that.
One of the promises, the vows that President Biden made when this war was starting was the promise to reinforce the eastern flank. Estonia obviously being one of those countries. There has been varying levels of frustration as far as how much of that has actually come to fruition, whether it's regarding weapons or sending additional forces to reinforce those countries. A lot of hesitation that it could be provocative. You're right there on the border, and it's a challenging issue. So do you feel today in November of 2023 that you're in a position where your security is ensured, not just by Estonia, but by all of NATO allies as well?
Yes. So answering your question, yes, but I want to just pick up on a few points that you mentioned. Provocation. I mean, NATO is a defensive alliance. It is not there to attack anybody, but to defend. So having arms that could defend your country or NATO is not the provocation.
Someone needs to tell Vladimir Putin that, I think.
Defense is not the provocation. I mean, Vladimir Putin can tell whatever, you know, this is provocation, but the question for us is how we react to this. Are we buying into this? Because, I mean, if, you know, there's talk that, oh, yeah, we shouldn't have the arms that reach Russia you know, close to NATO's borders. But that means the whole of my country's territory. And if you only have the upside that, you know, if you attack another country, they can't reach you, then you sure are you going to take this up if you have the aggressive mindset. So coming to the plans, we are quite happy about how NATO is functioning now. So we have, you know, the joint military plans. I mean, really how we do the exercises together, how the chain of command works, who gives orders to whom, which is important. But of course, they have to be fulfilled with the equipment and you know, ammunition. And there, of course, we have a lot to do in order to, invest more to defense. I mean, generally all the NATO's allies, and also to boost our defense industry.
One of the topics that comes up a lot in my travels in Europe is ammunition procurement, weapons procurement in general, the need for sort of more independence in terms of European, the defense industry. Estonia was central to the once unthinkable concept of joint ammunition procurement. And so how should pan-European defense initiatives like joint ammunition procurement and production evolve? What does the future look like in this area?
First, on this initiative, it was built on the idea how we reacted in COVID. So that was what I was proposing, that we did this together, procuring for the vaccines, and we did it fast. And with that, from idea to the launch of the initiative, it was only like a few months. So we got there. But of course, the question is how we go from here, because we have a lot of gaps in the defense industry. And it's a bit, chicken and egg issue, because the industry says that we don't have orders. And the countries say that we have all the pledges in place, but the pledges are not orders. So I think we should not only give the pledges, but actually go into real procurement to give the certainty to the defense industry to boost their production. But it takes time. But it's good initial initiatives that we have. The ASAP, which is for the ammunition. Then we have in different countries setting up this industrial base for defense industry. So there is a lot of room where we can move faster.
Okay, so you don't think that as far as defense cooperation goes in Europe that you've hit a ceiling of any kind, that there's still opportunity?
Yeah, there is still opportunity, because one thing is that when countries are investing in their defense, those countries that have much better neighbors than we do, their defense starts, from our borders. So, investing in their defense might also mean, regional cooperation. And we have done that with Latvians procuring for, joint air defense systems, for example, and we're going to see a lot of that in the future. And one other thing that I want to point out that I always stress is that we have the NATO standards. Let's use them, because what the Ukrainian war has shown us is that everybody is procuring and then tweaking a bit the ammunition. But then when you are in crisis, you want to exchange. Okay, you have those. Can I use those? But when everybody has different, then you can't exchange and use them in times of crisis.
Do you feel that the U.S. has a role to play here? Because partially some of the initial suggestions of more independence in the European defense industry came sort of out of too heavily relying on the U.S. for these things. And so where's the balance?
I think the balance is in Article 3, because Article 3 of NATO says that everyone has to do everything for their own defense. And then it's Article 5 that says it's collective defense as well, that you are going to, help your allies. So I think it is there. It's written there. We just have to fulfill it.
And obviously there's so much concern, sort of circling back to Ukraine. There's so much concern that time is running out and weapons are potentially, especially ammunition and things like that, are running out on the battlefield. And these discussions obviously trying to address a serious loss of ammunition globally. And so, what did the Ukraine war teach us as far as stocking up and having these additional resources to collectively develop ammunition and other
Well, it
systems?
teaches us that we have to be faster in, really increasing our production, and it has been very difficult. But at the same time, we are very technologically advanced. Why don't we use that innovation to make it faster? So. I think what is there is that first we should use the NATO standards. That is one lesson in Ukraine, that everybody has the same things, so that at least the ammunition works in the same way. That is definitely the lesson. And the second is that we should have, the stocks, of course, full of the things that we need. And then we have to boost also the defense industry, which hasn't been very easy.
Absolutely. I do want to give the audience a chance to get some questions in toward the end, but I do have a few more questions for you myself. Particularly, Sweden's government said last week that Estonia believes that damage to a telecommunications cable in the Baltic Sea between Sweden and Estonia was related to damage to a pipeline and cable between Estonia and Finland. It was an October 8th subsea gas pipeline and telecommunications cable connecting the two, which was damaged. Is there any evidence right now as we sit here that this may have been an act of sabotage? And if so, enough evidence to suggest who may be the perpetrator?
What we know is that it is human-made. We don't have that big animals in the Baltic Sea, or at least we don't know.
Right.
We know that it's human-made. The question is whether it was intentional or not. And the main suspect is a Chinese ship. That was with the anchor down, going like over hundreds of miles. I don't know much about sailing, but they say that it's illogical. But I can't say it's sabotage. We are investigating. We have sent help requests to China, and I was able to say today to Jake Sullivan that if they meet the Chinese president, maybe they can also say something about this, but let's see. So that they would help us to investigate what happened on that ship. Why did they lower the anchor, and was it intentional or not? And then if it was intentional, then why? Really, why? I don't know if you have heard, but the Russian cable was also cut. So there's a lot of cables.
A lot of intrigue, and obviously, we know about the Nord Stream, which was potentially sounds like a different situation. There was an explosion,
yeah.
But yet it really raises questions about the security of the underwater pipelines.
It does, and therefore I'm really happy that that NATO in Vilnius summit we agreed forming this under NATO's maritime command, this unit for protection of the underwater critical infrastructure. And there are companies, private companies, and as well as government actors here to really think how we can do that, because it's tough. I mean, it's underwater. You can't guard every centimeter or inch of those cables, but we definitely have to think about this and work together with this. And I'm glad to see also NATO moving the ships to our side of the sea that don't even think about this. So it is a deterrence in this regard if it was sabotage, but we can't say right now that it was.
Do you feel that there's area in particular in this for the U.S. to cooperate, to offer any expertise? Have you turned to them for any help?
No, we have turned to NATO and this maritime command, or this special unit that is under it. So they're probably thinking of what more could be there, but there are experts from different countries, different NATO's allies.
Right. You just mentioned Jake Sullivan and President Biden's potential definite meeting with Xi Jinping in San Francisco. Interestingly, Taiwan is looking to open a representative office in Estonia's capital. This will not go over well with Beijing, who believes that it will violate their One China policy. Is this something that your government is considering opening, being open to? And if so, where does this kind of put you in terms of your relationship with China?
there are 20 countries in Europe that have similar representations, but so far, I mean, if this request comes, then we will deal with this. But so far, we haven't had that. So the cultural relationships, the economic relationship, I think different regions are building on that, and it doesn't really affect the overall China policy.
Would you say now if you're open to it or not, or?
No, I mean, if the request comes, then we will look into it, and that is our decision. It's like not that we are saying that we are not doing this. We are a free country, and this is how things go. We went from the 16+1 format, like we exited it some years ago, because for us it is important that we act towards China as one voice. Because we are small, but together we are stronger. Therefore, it is important that we are in this European formats when we deal with the big players like China.
I mean, it's interesting because in the Baltics, you had Lithuania, which had some tensions with China in recent years over a number of different policies. Estonia, your relationship so far is okay, but there obviously is a growing sense of seeking alternatives, I guess, to China. And that has been sort of a global concept, certainly after COVID, with regard to diversifying supply chains and things like that. In Estonia, you have the Ukraine conflict sort of in your backyard. And so obviously that is a major focus, and Russia being a major focus. But more broadly, in terms of China and the challenges it poses, how do you address it?
We are concerned of the technological dependence that we have, or that we wouldn't have, with the actors that don't share our values, because every connection you have, the other side of this connection might also hurt you. So make sure that you're connected to friends, and I'm not entirely sure that this is the case. So we, being a very digital country, we really are looking into all our dependencies regarding technology. Considering the new innovations that there are, and I think everybody should do that.
So, kind of your big picture takeaway, before I turn to the audience, your big picture takeaway of your visit to Washington, obviously you've said that you didn't hear that much pushback from officials, but we're coming into a turbulent period right now. There's a looming government shutdown at the end of this week. We have a presidential election where really if the polls are anywhere near accurate, the outcome will be very uncertain. How does this look from where you sit in Estonia in terms of your future relationship with the U.S. and how both EU, NATO can engage?
The elections are always a turbulent time. It's always a time where it's a lot of uncertainty, and that is very clear that Russia is waiting for such times where there is a lot of attention away, or there is a lot of chaos that is related to election somehow. So we definitely have to see what happens with this. But in terms of every democracy that we work with chooses their own leaders, and so we have to work with those leaders that you choose for yourself.
Absolutely. My understanding is actually that you're going to be in a little bit of a rush, and so we have to end the Q&A. We have to save it for another time.
I have the most skeptical ones coming up now, so I'm really warmed up now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, you'll have to come back and join us another time, and we'll definitely save those questions for the hard questions for them. Thank you so much, Prime Minister. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Please take a seat and join us. We are so delighted to be joined here today by Director General for Migration and Home Affairs, Monique Parliat, who is here in town this week, of course, with the Justice and Home Affairs meeting happening here in Washington. Welcome, Madam Director General.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We're delighted to have you here. So I'm going to jump right in. You've had a busy week here. I'd love to hear a little bit about the major conclusions from the meeting. It was a very full agenda. And can you tell us what were the major topics of discussion?
Yes, I'm just coming out of the meeting of the ministerial meeting on Justice and Home Affairs, where we had the participation of Secretary Mayorkas and Attorney General Garland, and the Commissioner for Justice of the EU. I was representing the Home Affairs side, plus the Spanish and the forthcoming Belgian presidency. I think the main points of the meeting was to reaffirm our very solid and long cooperation and partnership, in particular in these very complicated times of geopolitical challenges. I think it's more than ever, it was more than ever necessary to insist on the strong transatlantic partnership we have between the EU and the U.S. on justice and home affairs. Of course, big topic was Ukraine, remains Ukraine, and we reaffirmed our unwavering support to Ukraine and its people. We still commit to continue to provide protection on both sides for those who have been forcibly displaced from Ukraine. And I just want to remind that we are still hosting 4 million Ukrainians in Europe. We also reaffirm our commitment to pursue the fulfillment of the accountability for atrocities that have been perpetrated in Ukraine by Russia. So to work on the prosecution of the crimes committed and to continue our good cooperation in that. I'm just browsing very quickly on the different points, but we may come back on some of them. We reiterated our commitment to ensure that Russia pays for the crimes that they have and the damages that they have inflicted to Ukraine and even further. We went beyond Ukraine on addressing security threats and also the threats for us. So one important aspect is the trafficking of weapons, and considering the massive proportion of small weapons and light firearms, we are also working together to ensure that we have a solid tracing of firearms to avoid that, to have them on European soil.
May I press you on that just a moment, Madam Director General? Can you tell us a little bit, I mean, you spoke about Ukraine and the extensive efforts you've engaged in there since the beginning of the war. Can you talk a little bit about those particular efforts to engage with criminal networks who might seek to exploit this ongoing war? What can you tell us about that information exchange and some of what that looks like, especially on the U.S.-EU side?
So on Ukraine in particular, we have since the beginning worked very closely with the U.S. to exchange information as much as possible on all kinds of possible terrorist consequences, and we have also a lot of fighters that fight even on both sides. So we need also to follow what could happen afterwards once the war will be over with them. But also and how far they can also be linked to possible networks. On the organized crime dimension, the big focus, as I said, is on the trafficking of arms and also trafficking of people. But so far, our assessment is that the trafficking of people has been seriously addressed from the beginning and is certainly existing, but very, very limited. Rather limited, but we are worried about the massive amount of arms that are circulating in.
If I may, thank you for that. Turn to terrorism for a moment, which I know is part of your very broad portfolio. We are just a few blocks today from a very large demonstration
in support of Israel and seeking a return for hostages from Hamas. You are also looking at terrorist incidents in Europe and the rise of anti-Semitism, something that the U.S. and EU unfortunately share in common. Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of that cooperation across borders, and also how you're looking at the current war in Israel and beyond, and thinking about what it means for safety for Europeans?
Yeah. Of course, the situation in the Middle East was very high on the agenda of our discussion this morning, and we recall the EU-U.S. Summit joint statement of the 20th of October 23. On the content, we had also to discuss the, I think beyond the attack, we need to discuss also the impact and the consequences of the attack on our respective internal security situations. So indeed, there is a rise of anti-Semitism, but what we see also on the European side is also a big risk of radicalization, of increasing radicalization. We have important Muslim communities in the EU that are also, for good reason, very sympathetic to the Palestinian situation. And there is a bit of a blurring line that some people may use to revive radicalization of people that would need very little to turn to act. We've seen that already, because we had just after the attack, the Hamas attack, we had one professor killed in France and two football supporters, Swedish ones, in Belgium. So, and these people were not necessarily part of very structured networks, but they were not either totally lone actors. They were influenced, clearly, and that's where what worries us on both sides, but even more on the European side, is this online radicalization. So that's something we will monitor very closely.
Yes.
And work very, very closely also with the U.S.
Yes, something to watch. Deeply concerning. Well, in our remaining time together, I understand that you are in the final weeks of your tenure in your current role, which also culminates in a 40-plus year career with the European Commission. Congratulations.
Thank you.
During that time, some things have changed.
Yes.
And one of which I know, which is near and dear to you, is the evolution of the need for data. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the nature of data, both as a challenge and opportunity that you've seen under your leadership, and how that's changed in your tenure.
I think we always had, we always needed data, but data have a new vectors today. You know, before it was written, paper data. Now it's all online. And we see more and more of, and of course, the online possibilities have expanded also the number of data that are circulating on any kind of issues, but also how they can be also distorted or biased. So I think this will be one of the big challenges of the future, is how we regulate data, how we monitor the circulation of data, the use of data. And one other aspect, in particular in my work, which is very important, is how we ensure also access to data for law enforcement authorities online, so that law enforcement authorities can do their work in the same way online as they do offline. And for the moment, this is a big issue, a big headache we are faced with on both sides of the Atlantic, how to ensure data protection, and everybody wants to have their communications protected, but at the same time be able to retain data for reasons that could be justified, but also access to these data and be able to use them when needed without having too much interference into the right of people to have their data protected. So that will be, for me, it is already, but it will be a big priority for the years to come.
Well, thank you for this and for your many decades of service. Please join me in thanking Director General Faria.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Please.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to the fun panel, the final panel of the third EU DFF. It's really wonderful to be here. The title of our session today, as the voice of God has announced, is Big Bets and Long Odds, a look ahead at the EU-U.S. relationship in a new geopolitical environment. I have a really stellar panel here of colleagues and friends with me to discuss this. Just very brief introductions. Tara Varma is a visiting fellow at the Center of the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. Ambassador Dan Fried, here from the Atlantic Council, the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow, former U.S. Ambassador to Poland. Dr. Liana Fix, who's a fellow for Europe at the Council of Foreign Relations, and Peter Rao, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. We have sort of some time to discuss the big issue, and it's a really big issue. We'll go many ways, and we'll try and open it up to questions at the end. If you have any questions and you're watching us online, please head on over to askac.org and place your questions there, and I will try and fit them in at the end. So to get us started on this big topic, let's start with the question of Ukraine. I'd say in the run-up to to Ukraine's counteroffensive this spring and summer, the transatlantic relationship was really firing on all cylinders. There was a lot of coordination. There was criticism that aid was not maybe coming fast enough to the Ukrainians, but nevertheless, it really was a high point. Now, several months later, I don't know, I think it's fair to say that the mood has changed a little bit. Ukraine's top general, Valery Zaluzhny, told The Economist recently that he does not expect a beautiful breakout as a result of the counteroffensive. He called it stalemated. And I know most of the experts here on stage have at one time and another certainly warned that this war would be long and that there wouldn't be any magic bullets. Nevertheless, it does feel like it's a moment of sort of reckoning as we sort of look at what the long war looks like. And meanwhile, here in the United States, we've had early campaigning by Donald Trump, I think successfully starting to polarize U.S. support for Ukraine funding, and we're seeing that in the fight in the Hill right now. And the breakout of the bloody war in the Middle East has also stressed the Biden administration's claims that it can walk and chew gum at the same time. So far, we're still managing, but it's definitely a test at this point. So first question, let's start with you, Tara. Give us a sense of how the transatlantic relationship looks like today with maybe Ukraine as the jumping off point.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Damir. It's very nice to be here. You're right. I think we're now almost 2 years into the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to be precise. The transatlantic unity has held quite strongly, but what we're seeing is once again that Europe is very dependent on the US and very dependent and contingent on US domestic tribulations. And so what we're seeing is that support to Ukraine might be contingent to what's happening here domestically, which I think is also totally understandable. The U.S. political and military leadership in helping Ukraine has been absolutely central, also in getting Europeans to foster their aid and their support. But what we're seeing now is, I wouldn't say a U.S. withdrawal, but certainly questions and fewer support from the American population to the support in Ukraine. And so that has a lot of consequences for us Europeans in managing to build up our support to make it more sustainable financially, but also militarily, which is not something that we're very good at in Europe, that we haven't been very good at until now. I guess we won't have a choice but to be better at it. But it certainly questions how we're going to be able to work through this together. I think that's there's one element here, I would say, which is a differentiation between the US and Europe, which is that for Europe, a victory for Ukraine is existential to its security. I think for the US, it's absolutely crucial, but it is more a matter of international security. And I would say this is, I think, one difference that we're seeing here, and all the more reason, I would say, for Europe to do more, whatever happens domestically in the US. I think if the situation stays as it is, then Europe will only be a better partner to the US. If the situation changes somehow, Europe will at least have been prepared.
Ambassador Fried, Am I being too pessimistic in the sort of layout I gave it? How do you read the situation now?
I don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to end, but I've got a pretty good idea how it will not end. It will not end with the Russian victory parade down the Khreshchatyk. The bracket of most likely outcomes now is still a lot better than we thought it would be in February 2022. So what are we talking about? Most of Ukraine is free and will remain free. The Ukrainians did not succeed with their land offensive. They have done better with their strategic attacks on Russian targets, right? Russian Black Sea fleet had to retreat to the wrong side of the Black Sea. So what we're talking about is, at worst for Ukraine, a failure of the Russian effort to conquer them. And the challenge for Europe and the United States is, in that case, would be supporting, let's call it free Ukraine, making it viable and secure over the long run. That would be a strategic defeat for Putin. He didn't start the war to grab the Donbass. He started the war to subjugate all of Ukraine. And that he will fail to do. Sure, we had, all of us, hopes for better on the land offensive. But still, this is not a time for gloom and doom. It is a time to start thinking about the long-term support for Ukraine. That means economic support. And by the way, the collective West is sitting on $300+ billion of perfectly good immobilized Russian assets, and long-term security for Ukraine. And yeah, that does mean NATO membership at the end of the day. And the Biden administration has come a long way, not as far as some of us would like, but it has come a long way and deserves credit. So I see the elements for strategic success, even though I won't argue with your, I wouldn't call it pessimistic, but sober assessment of the situation. And as you know, there are a couple of wild cards, but we'll get into those later. There is a reasonable path forward that ends well for, if I can use the old-fashioned term, the free world.
Excellent. Liana, I guess taking what Tara said about the the contingency of sort of European solidarity, and then Ambassador Fried's call for the long-term vision. How does it look from the European side? Is there can Europe meet the clarion call that Ambassador Fried just laid out?
I think those are really the two miscalculations that were just outlined by Tower and by the. Those are the two miscalculations that were just outlined by Tower and the ambassador that we are facing now, and why we need to adapt our expectations in this moment, and why we are at an inflection point, especially if it is even from the Ukrainian side, acknowledge that we are in a stalemate. And the first is, as Tower laid out, this kind of leaderless unity, as Karolik mentioned it, in Europe, which is backfiring at a time when the US is overstretched with other agenda items, with the Israel-Hamas war. So in the past, it was very easy, since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, for the US to call Paris, to call Berlin, to call Warsaw. But now we would have a moment where we would need Europeans to step up in a leadership role, and they're not used to that, because that's not what they've done in the last, since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. And the second is exactly the trap that we have laid for ourselves with too optimistic expectations for the counteroffensive, and also communicating in the public this over-optimistic expectation. So the whole idea of military leverage translating into diplomatic leverage that Jake Sullivan and the NSC have put forward, this has not worked. I mean, Russia is not more malleable to negotiations at all. And at the same time, Ukraine is not in a stronger negotiation position than it was before the counteroffensive. So I think what we have to avoid in the future is, on the one hand, to have these over-optimistic expectations that victory for Ukraine is just around the corner. And if we deliver this one weapon or the other weapon, I don't want to underestimate how important F-16s are and Towers are. but that this will be sort of the crucial turn, and then Ukraine will have a full blown-out battle victory. This is not going to happen. We need to adapt our expectations to a long war for Ukraine and to long support for Ukraine. And the second trap that we should not fall into now is to say, well, this has not worked, let's rush into negotiations, because there really is just no indication that Russia's optimism has decreased. I mean, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, it's the perfect position to wait for the outcome of the US elections in 2024. And that's a challenge at a time when the US Congress is really questioning military funding for Ukraine that no one can replace. And I think that's something which Europeans tend to underestimate in what kind of disruptive moment we are currently in US domestic politics. So this moment when Congress is actually challenging Ukraine support should be seen as the first warning signal for a long-term preparation for the return of disruption in US politics, possibly culminating in November 2024. And instead, it's more like a wait and see from European capitals. Perhaps it will not be as bad as we hope. Perhaps it will be only for years if sort of the worst case scenario for Europeans takes place. So I think this should be the time for serious contingency planning in European capitals on Ukraine and also on their own security. But I don't feel this urgency right now, which is making me concerned.
Peter, your perspective, everything you've heard so far. Let's focus. I guess on both sides. Both the U.S. and the European partners. How likely is that kind of message of the long view, communicating it out to publics? You think that's going to be feasible, and you see people getting ready to make that case?
Well, first of all, thanks to Jan Fleck and the Atlantic Council for having me. It's a bit daunting being on a panel which Damir here is moderating, because I think those of us in the think tank community who regularly have to pitch articles know that Damir, now at the Washington Post, but at the American Interest, is a man of big ideas. And this panel description, big bets and long odds, reminds me of trying to submit things to Damir. So I hope my answers are worthy of Damir's grand ambitions for the panel. I think I would just start by saying that we oftentimes think of alliances as automatic or self-perpetuating, and in the case of the West, we have the Parlement, the glass modern building in the heart of Brussels, which communicates that. On the outskirts of the city, NATO's new gleaming headquarters. And we shouldn't forget that alliances periodically do undergo stress tests. The EU, dating back to, I would say, the financial crisis, has undergone quite a few in the last 15 years. Prior to that, we just thought of the EU as every 6 months having a nice council meeting where there'd be concluding fireworks and we would go on to the next EU presidency. And NATO really hasn't faced a major significant stress test. Some might quibble with that, but of this level, which was just described by Tara as existential in the war in Ukraine. So that stress test, I think, means that the constituent members of the alliance, but also our opponents, consider the credibility and the capabilities of the alliance, and that will then matter whether or not it shatters or remains cohesive going into the future. I think we have two major structural advantages in this contest. The first is the enormous economic power of the West, which dwarfs the Russian Federation. If we count together all of the NATO and EU member states, it runs into the tens of trillions of euros or dollars, since we're talking both sides of the Atlantic, compared against the Russians, who are sometimes belittled as having an economy the size of Italy, with all due respect to the Italians, but just one member of our alliance. And secondly, we were given, by happenstance, a partner in Ukraine who has shown enormous tenacity, courage, and capability, able to adapt its war strategy, bring on board new systems. It also happens to have an enormous amount of territorial depth, which has allowed, I think, the West to sustain its effort to Ukraine, for Ukraine to remain in the fight. But there are, I think, also problems in the alliance. One being that I think this incremental, cautious, and tepid approach to arming the Ukrainians, giving them just enough to stay in the fight, but not enough to break through to victory, has in part condemned the Ukrainians to perpetual warfare. And in a way, the Ukrainians are bleeding out. They're bleeding white because of this. And secondly, that very strategy, I think, partially responds to your question, Damir, because it puts enormous pressure on our collective domestic politics, because it does mean a long war that drags out over many months, and now we are in the space of years. I will say, just as an empirical fact, wars tend not to end in negotiated solutions. They tend to end in victory or defeat. And I'm not a believer that we necessarily have a frozen conflict off-ramp to conflate metaphors that is going to create a long stability for Ukraine or for Eastern or even all of Europe. I don't think that the North Korea DPRK, ROK, South Korea analogy or the Israel model really applies to Ukraine. And to get to Ambassador Fried's comment about where things stand, to my thinking, the Russians don't have enough power to create a new order in Ukraine. I entirely agree with that. They're not going to be marching down Kyiv and celebrating on the Maidan. But they do have enough power to disrupt Ukraine and try to keep it a basket case, wholly dependent as a landlocked country on Western aid for survival, thereby pressuring our politics even more. So for that reason, it's crucial that the Ukrainians are able to open up the Black Sea as a commodity exporting economy. It's crucial that even if we did eventually go to negotiations, they receive the weapons and military support to have any chance in talks with the Russians at some point in the future. And I'm still cautiously optimistic that both in the US and in Europe, we have enough support to run those strategies. And just one perhaps last comment on that. There's a lot of attention paid in the United States and in Europe, looking at the United States on Republicans in Congress and Republican opinion polling. And last I checked, if one adds together or does some sort of math calculations on where Republican support is, let's say it's around 40% of Republicans are prepared to support more aid and assistance to Ukraine. Name me one other issue where 40% of Republicans are prepared to support a policy closely identified with President Biden. We're an extremely polarized society on tax policy, on immigration policy. I'd venture to say it's 5%. So perhaps this is a bit like the right track, wrong track question that's kind of famous in American politics. When you're out of power, the country's going to hell in a handbasket. When you're in power, it's all honey and light. And so I could easily imagine if a Republican eventually took power, perhaps Republican attitudes, if it's identified with a Republican president, might switch somewhat, and perhaps Democrats might switch a little bit too. So at the risk of, as a foreign policy analyst, delving into domestic politics, I just wanted to add that caveat that part of the policy of Ukraine is refracted through domestic American politics, and maybe our foreign policy attitudes are still a bit healthier than one might suspect.
Thanks, Peter. It's a lot to chew on over there.
We have a big brain, as I mentioned at
No,
the
no, I
outset.
mean, really, really good stuff. And I want to get back to the question of domestic politics in a bit, but let's talk a little bit about one point you raised, and that is, I think it's an incontestable fact that the West is economically and militarily dominant at this point. Nevertheless, you know, I alluded to the walk and chew gum at the same time problem for the United States. We're looking at the politics. Like I said, we should get back to that later, playing its role. And, you know, I saw today there was a report that the EU would miss its target of providing Ukraine with 1 million shells by March. The FT was reporting that the next round of sanctions is being held up in the Commission, likely will pass, but stuff's happening there. So in the broader backdrop here, can I ask you guys to assess then the ability then again of the West to now push through and mobilize this kind of support in light of everything we've talked about so far? Is this just the EU policy process at work that is loud and noisy and sometimes slow, but usually gets there at the right point? Or is more effort required? Tara?
I think it's both. I think the EU somehow is also walking and chewing gum at the same time. It has agreed basically to get Ukraine and Moldova into accession talks to get inside the European Union. It's doing so while Ukraine is at war because Russia invaded it. And so it's doing something it has never, I mean, it's doing several things it has never done in the past. It's providing weapons to a country that is not a member of NATO, not a member of the EU. It has now said that it's going to produce missiles and ammunitions together, buy these weapons and ammunitions and missiles together for Ukraine. This is unprecedented. So the number of things that the EU has done through this mechanism called the European Peace Facility is actually pretty unprecedented. It's thinking now of very seriously integrating Ukraine and Moldova in the Union and thinking about reforming the Union at the same time, because now we're talking about, of course, integrating Ukraine and Moldova, but also possibly the Western Balkan countries. And so we're talking and thinking about a union of 35, 37 maybe member states. So it will have to work very differently inside the European Parliament, the Commission, the Council. And so it's doing something. Actually, it's working pretty fast, I would say, in traditional EU terms. At the same time, it has to provide more for Ukraine. I mean, the EU really doesn't have a choice. And the question now is how will it manage to do things? It will have to buy some weapons and some ammunitions off the shelves, and it will have to think mid to long term about being able to produce this, to build a defense industrial base, something which was honestly pretty taboo in most European Union member states, I would say, until last year. And so we're having these discussions now. I think sometimes people in Washington don't realize how far the EU has come. I'm not saying that everything is perfect and great, but I do want to stress here that we're having serious discussions about security and defense in a European context that we would not have been able to have again as early as last year. So I think we're trying to do this. To do all of this basically simultaneously. And of course, we're looking at the US because the US is still our major ally, and we're still very much dependent on the US. If the US decides tomorrow or next week that there will be no aid package for Ukraine, we don't have a substitution plan now. We will have to think about it, but it's going to be really, really detrimental to European security.
Ambassador Fried, I don't know. I can't imagine that we won't get our ducks in order. I just imagine this is a bunch of politics here in the United States to get the funding for Ukraine eventually. It'll take some time. It's my sort of sense talking to people. Your sense on that, and maybe then just to build on that, let's assume that we here in the United States get our ducks in order and get the next tranche of support for Ukraine. How would you prioritize things that you would like to see our allies do in sort of helping Ukraine the next step?
Yeah, I think in the short to medium term, there will be aid for Ukraine passed. I think that'll happen. And we're probably talking to some of the same people. And yeah, I see it happening. But there are two related big issues. It's called big bets and long odds. So let's dive into that. I don't think, and I'm jumping ahead to the next topic, but you set it up.
Yep.
I don't think Donald Trump will win. But it doesn't matter what I think. He might. And if he does, he is in earnest. He stands for America first. And the last time the America First crowd had a chokehold on Washington, the result was catastrophe. That's World War II. Okay? It happened in part because of our absence. That's on us. The only thing worse than a military-industrial complex is not having enough of one, which is what you were saying, and you're right. Europe is having, you're also right, that Europe is having more serious conversations about European defense. Well, it better. Whatever happens with American politics, Europe is going to have to stop talking about the theory of strategic autonomy, which is what I've heard from the French for decades. And they're going to have to, the Europeans will have to start walking the walk of, if not European strategic autonomy, because that's a theological issue in some ways, European strategic capability. I would prefer it be channeled through NATO. But I'll take whatever institutional arrangements the European political process requires if we get some, which is European strategic capability. Now, Europe's way behind the curve. On the other hand, Europe was way behind the curve on energy. I can't tell you how many conversations I had with the Germans where they said it was impossible to wean themselves from Russian gas. Well, they did it because they had to, and it's expensive and it's tough, but all credit to the Germans. They did it. They did it because Putin put a gun to their head. You know, the Poles did better, they were prepared. Europe is going to have to do this or prepare for it. And hopefully we will come out of this with a stronger Europe. The price the Americans will pay for our flirtation with Trumpism is that the Europeans may end up with greater strategic capability, and therefore a more equal transatlantic dialogue. That's okay. I have a very good feeling about working with Brussels, with the European, with the Commission, with the EEAS. It does work, and if you listen to von der Leyen, no, we are in sync. A stronger EU doesn't bother me at all. It's a good thing. We're going to need it. Anyway, I wanted to throw that stuff out there. Yeah, there's a way ahead, but the Europeans are going to have to look down the pit of an America under Trump. And it's not the Republicans. I mean, any other Republican candidate, there'd be the usual turmoil and we'd be fine. Trump is different. And that's something we have to take seriously.
So, Liana, building on that, would you say it was a mistake for Joe Biden to say that America is back, that it actually lulled the Europeans and cost them 2-3 years to sort of snap into this?
Yeah, I think the sort of strategic question behind America is back is to what extent was sort of the Trump presidency an exception, or to what extent was it the beginning of a strategic realignment of U.S. foreign policy, which is interrupted by the Biden presidency, but will then continue with any other candidate, right? And I mean, I think this question is still very much out there, and that's sort of the strategic question that should be in the minds of Europeans. But let me try to be very un-European here. I think I would obviously entirely agree that Europe has to take more responsibility for its own defense as a pillar within NATO, in whatever format, EU format that it wants to. But if we are realistic, this is a completely theoretical discussion. I mean, this is something which will not take 1 year of preparation until the next US elections. This is something that even if Europeans would have started it in 2016 with the election of Trump, they would not have come very far, because the lack of sort of strategic capabilities that Europeans have is really deep. This is a generational task. And there's some great, a couple of years ago, the IISS did some great scenarios about sort of mid-range conflicts that can happen sort of in the Western Balkans, how long it will take for Europeans and how much money they have to invest to come to a point where they can take care of a mid-sized conflict in the Western Balkans on their own. And the result is it will take a decade, if not an entire generation, to come to that point. So this discussion is a little bit, I mean, it's necessary politically, but there's just no way how Europeans they should start it, but there's just no way how Europeans can be ready for a Trump presidency or for a US president who turns away from Europe or questions the credibility of NATO. So I think there we have to be realistic on what Europeans can do and what they cannot do. On the plus side, whenever European delegations are coming into Washington, they are sort of particularly concerned about instability in the US. Whereas US Americans always ask, oh, what about instability in Europe, right? I mean, Hungary and Slovakia and so on. I do think the picture is right now that Europe is more stable than the United States. It is more stable in its support for Ukraine. It is more stable. Hungary and Slovakia is something that can be managed and has been managed in the past. So the problem child at the moment is indeed the United States and the US support for Ukraine. But that doesn't help Europe if it comes to the serious questions of security and defense, which again is a decade, if not a generational task to complete. What Europeans can do is to prepare to give really no space for attack sort of for the US election season. And there I'm thinking in particular about the NATO summit in Washington next year. If Europeans don't show up there with the majority of Europeans spending 2%, they will inadvertently help a Trump campaign with that. So preparing for that, showing up in Washington and saying, well, look, we are almost all spending more than 2% here. That's the first thing that Europeans should work on now and try to create their budgets or to shift their budgets in a creative way and to really get the numbers right until the Washington summit. That's the first part. And the other part which can help, especially with discussions in Congress right now, is to signal that Europeans are willing to take on more of the financial burden for Ukraine, because that's one of the discussions which is taking place among Republicans. Well, perhaps we do the military support for Ukraine, but why do we also have to do the financial support? And that's something where Europeans cannot take over all of the financial support. The budgetary support for Ukraine is sort of half-half between the US and Europe right now, but where they can signal willingness to take on more support. Because again, as Tara said, the military part cannot be substituted, but the financial part can be substituted for Europeans. And that's sort of kind of the contingency planning that I would want Europeans to do right now, instead of having these big theoretical debates about how independent Europe should be from the US. I mean, that's again, something for a generation to discuss.
I know, Peter, you're looking to jump in. I'll let you in one sec. The only thing I'd say, Liana, yeah, perhaps the United States is seeming more unstable now, but U.S. instability has more impacts on European security. That's the nasty part of it. That it's the dependence element that's still at the core of this. Peter, please.
Well, I would just start on the NATO summit. I think it's important that the NATO summit be a American hosted summit, which is to say it isn't just an opportunity for the president to stand up and in the middle of the political season in Washington be sort of feted. I mean, it would be great if Republicans in Congress are part of the welcoming committee as a way. The way these summits used to be, I think they become increasingly concentrated in the executive. So an American government summit as much as it is a White House summit. Secondly, I would say to take it away from the theoretical and perhaps to ride to the rescue of Donald Trump a bit, at least in one area where I think his policies were better than that of the Biden administration or the EU, is on the JCPOA and Iran. Our Iran policy is totally in tatters, and I'll connect that to Iran. Iranian drones travel over the Caspian on a regular basis, are handed over to the Russians. There's now co-production that's going to take place between the Russians and the Iranians, and they're raining down on Ukrainian cities on a regular basis. I, on my meager think tank salary, could buy a few of these drones. That's how cheap they are. The political economy of shooting them down with expensive air defenses is horrendous deal for the West in a time of tight budgets. We had Andrei Yermak, the head of the presidential office of Ukraine, who's in town at my institute, Hudson Institute, last night. I lost count of the number of times that he referenced air defenses. So if we want the Europeans, since you're asking what do we want of the Europeans, to take a measure, what about thinking about snapback on the JCPOA sanctions? The day that the German chancellor is set to fly out of Tel Aviv after a solidarity visit to Israel following the October 7th attack, he has to be hustled off of the plane on the tarmac into a bunker or a shelter, and his delegation is lying flat on the runway because Iranian missiles are flying overhead. That day, the missile embargo sunsets within the JCPOA. I just think it's time to reconsider our Iran policy, to recognize that the Iranians are active in multiple theaters doing us harm, and to perhaps consider a pressure track against Iran rather than an engagement policy, which I think has hit a total dead end to date.
I wasn't really planning to actually delve in the Middle East, but I think it's a good point, and it gets at a different question. That one of the things you hear here in Washington among, I would say, a small group of conservatives is this idea that the Europeans should take care of Europe. Allies, all good, pick up the slack while we go tend to other things. I think what you're getting there, Peter, is the other approach that the alliance should actually be aligned on a broader spectrum of things. Let me throw that question to the panel. I mean, Tara, how do you think that what would work best in Europe? This idea of a strong transatlantic alliance and trying to hammer out policy differences on questions like the Middle East, on Iran, on China, which we haven't even talked about yet, and should there be sort of a solid Western bloc, or is it better to try and do this kind of division of labor in security? That is, we're allied, there are shared interests, there are shared values that help inform that, but that there's a kind of spreading of attention.
I don't believe in division of labor. I mean, I'm going to take it to the Indo-Pacific here. I think this is an argument that we're hearing a lot. Europe should deal with Europe and the US can deal with China. Well, we see that things are not always that simple. One day Russia decides to invade Ukraine. Another day Hamas decides to commit a horrible attack on Israel. So it's not, first of all, I don't think it's that simple. Also, I think it kind of negates the idea that there are European interests beyond Europe. And actually, the fact that Europe wants to have a foreign policy, foreign and security policy, means that it will have interest in China, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, and in Europe. And it has to work if we're really believers in this transatlantic relationship, then we'll have to be believers in the fact that we have shared interests beyond the pure and sole continent. And I think we absolutely, what we need to do right now is fight against the logic of blocs. There is a huge risk of fragmentation of the international order right now. A number of forces and adversaries of the US and Europe are working towards that. So actually we have to spend a lot more energy and effort in making sure that we're preserving the international order, giving more energy and support to the UN as well. There are a few instances where we need these international organizations to work more strongly. We see it. I mean, the Middle East is one example where the EU has been extremely weak and divided and has, not even talking about differences between the member states, even inside the European institutions, between the European Council, the Commission, and the EES, there are differences of views, which we've basically seen laid bare in the press. We need to work at actually building a much stronger policy. I really don't believe in division of labor. I think that's very dangerous. That would, again, be asking basically less of European than they're capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Fried, same question to you. You talked about, there's still a good shot for the free world and getting it together. Again, how do you think that the transatlantic alliance fits into making that a reality?
I want to foot stomp what we just heard because I profoundly agree with it. There was a fashionable notion that our support for Ukraine was just distracting us from dealing with China, the real enemy, right? It was very fashionable among the Asia First crowd until the Taiwanese, Japanese, and South Koreans said, wait. We all need to succeed in blunting Putin's aggression against Ukraine. That's important to our security. Let's not assume we know more about their security than they do. They understood that these issues are linked, so I profoundly agree with Tara. She's right. We and the Europeans need to get our act together on very difficult trade and technology issues so we can use our relative strength and deal in a peaceful but powerful manner with China. This is doable, and you saw the US-EU summit didn't produce an agreement on steel and aluminum tariffs, and there was a lot of snarky commentary that this shows that all this talk about transatlantic unity is hogwash. Well, yeah, but the Biden administration is trying to do, and a lot of Europeans are trying to think through new international economic policy. It's going to be discussed tomorrow. But I'm going to throw some of this stuff out. It's really interesting. What does friend shoring mean? What does de-risking mean? De-risking it was originally a term from the German government. Now it's a bumper sticker for everybody. What that means is we're not decoupling from China. We're not engaging in an economic split, but we're lowering our exposure, which is exactly right. But what does this mean in practice? And how do we deal with industrial policy? The Europeans are upset because the Biden administration is talking this way. Well, the French have been doing this for years. But there's a way to make this work. We just couldn't get it done in time for the US-EU summit. The larger point is the free world does need to get its act together, and we can do so. You heard at the opening of this conference, the EU and Fred Kemp falling all over themselves to be in sync and say so. That wouldn't have been possible a number of years ago. Now it is. So let's use that. I'm reasonably optimistic. And by the way, look, if you want to make the case for a different Iran policy, go ahead. I mean, there's a case to be made. I get that. The trouble, I don't disagree with you, and I don't even disagree that there were serious people in the Trump administration who were thinking this through. The problem is Trump wasn't one of them. And that's why I distinguish between Trump and his entourage and a lot of the Republicans. Somebody like Nikki Haley would almost certainly agree with you on Iran policy. But if she were president, I would tell our European friends, fine, relax, it's okay. That's the challenge hanging over us. Sorry to go off.
No, not
in
at
the
all, not
tangent,
at all. I mean, there's a lot there as well. Liana, President Xi is in San Francisco tomorrow, and we're anticipating maybe lowering the temperature between China and the United States. I take everything that Tara and Ambassador Fried talked about just now about sort of shared visions, priorities. Are there opportunities here now, as the Biden administration tries to sort of get its China policy on a firmer footing? How can there be cooperation there?
Yeah, let me perhaps make myself a little bit unpopular right now and push a bit back against this narrative of, the free world against its enemies, Russia, Iran, China, all at the same time. I mean, in terms of a narrative view, I would obviously agree with that, but I do think we have to be a little bit careful to make analytical distinctions between conflicts we have and the strategic level of importance that we attach to these conflicts, and also to be honest about the different types of conflicts that we have. So I was concerned about having a too strong linkage, for example, between Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas war, because I do think these are two completely different cases. And the danger and the risk that we see there is that China and Russia are pushing a narrative which they hope will, with their positioning on Palestine, which they hope will lead to a situation where they can accuse the West of double standards. That's what they're doing, like all day long, comparing Israel, Hamas, Palestine with Ukraine, and thereby sort of trying to shift the mood in parts of the global South, quotation mark, that especially Ukraine has worked hard to convince of their case and to shift the mood there, right? So I think we have to be a little bit careful with not falling into, this trap to say, well, these are all our enemies and it's all the enemies of the free world. There are distinctions between adversaries that there are between the types of conflicts, and throwing it all together just creates this kind of op-ed narrative, nothing against op-eds, but this kind of op-ed narratives that, Biden is drawn into another war in Israel and then in Ukraine, and then we have only forever wars, which just doesn't make sense. I mean, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan were wars with U.S. engagement, very costly wars. What we see now is support for Ukraine and support for Israel. It's not this big, being drawn into all kinds of wars narrative, which some parts of the public see, and that I think leads to the China question right now. And I think it's interesting that China is the part of the equation which is most hopeful right now. I think a couple of months ago that's not something that anyone would have expected, because our conversations were dominated by China, and the risk of China. So I think in terms of seeing this as a sign, it is a hopeful sign for diplomacy. It is obviously an important meeting. I think we have to be careful not to try exactly the same that we tried with Vladimir Putin in July 2021. That was sort of the moment where there was the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva, and the idea was, well, we just establish guardrails to the relationship, we establish strategic stability, and some kind of stabilizing element in the relationship. And a little bit of that idea is also there with China, to establish military-to-military contacts again with China, something which is obviously missing, but also because China just doesn't have the kind of same appreciation that Russia, had for sort of this kind of arms control, military-to-military conflicts, because they lack the historical socialization of Cold War times and of arms control arrangements and so on. So I think we should be careful not to try to, and you outlined this in your question, not to try to park China for the election year and to hope this will not explode, which is exactly what we tried with Russia in July 2021, and it did explode, right? So I think the expectations have to be very modest when it comes to the summit, and not just hoping that, just because we talk about guardrails and mil-mil contexts, those are already established, and we will not expect any crisis from that corner of the world. Mm.
Peter, any thoughts on basically this kind of align? I mean, you kicked off the whole question about getting Europe to align on Middle East policy on Iran. Are you hopeful that you can be able to, that deft leadership on both sides of the Atlantic could craft a kind of common policy going forward on a lot of these crises that are facing us?
Well, first of all, I do think as Americans, we tend to bifurcate those regions because our entire vernacular is really as an ocean-going peoples behind two major oceans built that way, the transatlantic alliance, the Indo-Pacific. But if we don't think in terms of, say Mahan and instead think Mackinder, it becomes Eurasia, and Europe is really one end of the Eurasia map, and Taiwan sits just off the other end of Eurasia. I think if we transform our thinking into that, we see the connections between these regions, and I think that's important because while I am not for compartmentalizing these regions, I think it's important to burden shift to the Europeans in Europe to the extent we can, but to remain actively involved, just as I think it's important for Europe to be active in the Indo-Pacific so that it's not just the frothing at the mouth Americans who are warning about the Chinese threat, but also ASEAN countries which are experiencing Chinese bullying, the Australians who've gone through a major trade dispute, Hong Kong, which is a free city that's been extinguished from the free world, and on, the Japanese with regular trade disputes. You name it, go down the list of Chinese pernicious behavior, active hot war conflict with batons against the Indians. All of that, I think, helps build a shared threat perception, because if there is a war, if all else fails and the Chinese go at Taiwan, it won't be like Ukraine. There will be potentially thousands of dead Americans on day one at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And if the response from Europe then is to say, well, Taiwan isn't a country even as we recognize it, and it's part of China anyway, our trade relations are so important, that would make the current imbroglio over burden sharing dating back to Wales in the Midwest where I come from nothing compared to the tensions we would feel in the alliance. Now, it might be that should we lose such a war, we would need Europe as a fallback position anyway, and we would overcome it. But I would think it'd be very tough road to hoe if we had, like Macron after his visit to the region, basically shrug the shoulders and say that we don't see things the same way and it's not that important to us. So I think it's very important that we have European buy-in, even if we don't expect Europe to militarily be active in a conflict. There are things they can do on supply lines, maybe satellite communications aid, et cetera, but I don't think the Charles de Gaulle is going to be firing on the coast of China. Last point I would make about areas where Europe has real power, like the trade and technology front, where we have the TTC. I'm all for working with the Europeans and trying to find common ground. My only caution, my only somewhat kind of hesitancy or concern is that we essentially develop a lowest common denominator regulatory approach where we choke off our innovation in key areas that are going to decide the economic and military future. So if we're in a negotiation with Europe on areas like AI, where Europe has lagged for good reason, not because they lack the bright minds, but because the regulatory framework is backwards, and we choose for the sake of EU-U.S. unity to go with the European regulatory framework, I would be applauding in Beijing because it'll hold us back from competing in something that might very well decide the future. I'm a transatlanticist. I'm all for these talks. I'm all for having these working groups. But it's something that I would keep in the back of our minds because it turns out economic growth does matter. That is latent military power. And these technologies are potentially revolutionary, and who knows what the future will hold. So I think it's crucial that we win those technological competitions with the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Very good points. Lots to think about. I guess as we wrap here, let me just ask our friends on the panel. We've been sort of, I guess, thinking about worst case scenarios. But what are some low-hanging fruits that I think maybe we need to focus on now, immediately, to strengthen the transatlantic alliance? What have we missed in talking about these big geostrategic visions? Where can we grow together? I mean, I think Peter's last remark there was a bit of a provocation on some of the knottier tech issues, but where should we be focusing our pragmatic energies right now, Tara?
So first of all, I wanted to agree with something the ambassador said. It's not all doom and gloom. The election hasn't happened yet. There's actually a whole year to go before the election happens. This is also a year of opportunity for Europeans and Americans. I think it's not so easy to find low-hanging fruits. We were hopeful that the steel and aluminum tariff was going to be one a few weeks before the EU-U.S. summit. It seemed to be almost a slam dunk. It wasn't, and I think that's also fine. We don't have to agree immediately on everything, but we do have to sort things out. I think the tariff issue is a bit emblematic still because this was something that was a legacy of the Trump era, and it seemed kind of logical that it would be gone with the current Biden administration, and things are not so simple. They are here building a foreign policy for the middle class. This has implications for Europeans too. The IRA had implications for Europeans. I think as Europeans, we need to face that. We certainly need to do a lot more for climate. We need to think about industrial policy, I would say, in a common way. I think we can do that. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said that basically the Washington consensus was gone and we had to build a post-Washington consensus. This is something, again, where Europeans and Americans have a huge role to play, thinking about the future of international financial institutions, but even the future of international institutions as themselves, make them more representative, think about UN Security Council reforms. I think if we're serious about upholding the current international order, this is something where actually we have a bit of alignment on, and where clearly we're not aligned at all with Beijing and Moscow. And so I think we do have a lot of weight to put behind that. We have a case to make also to the global south. This is something that we need also, I think, to be very serious about. We didn't discuss this, but I do want to put it out there. So there are a number of issues, I think, on which we agree and we can work together. And I would say, particularly when looking at the international order, this might be one of the few things that will be at risk next year. But again, we have 12 months ahead of us. I think we need to be constructive and work together now because things haven't changed.
Ambassador Fried, constructive ideas, low-hanging fruits, or even medium-hanging fruits. Got to stretch a little bit.
Tony Blinken would love some low-hanging fruit. I mean, just look at the guy.
What are you suggesting, Ambassador? That he's short?
No, that everybody's always looking for low-hanging fruit, and it doesn't exist.
Got it.
Because somebody else, it would already be grabbed.
Yeah.
But we have, I would put it this way, we have some advantages. The macroeconomic picture is pretty good. The technology picture, I mean, I take Peter's cautionary point about technology, but we're doing pretty well, especially the United States, maintaining a technological lead. You know, I don't believe that the Chinese are going to, whatever our problems, I'd rather have ours than theirs at this point. So we've got some assets. Tara is absolutely right. We can close on some of these economic issues, I think. And it is hard because the Washington consensus has been battered, but not yet replaced. We're groping toward it. But that's, you can sense it out there. That's not low-hanging fruit, but it is achievable. And that puts the US and Europe in sync on a lot of key issues. It enables us to deal with a lot of these problems from a position of relative strength. That's possible. And if, you know, Liana's right about the problems of Ukraine, the dangers of a so-called frozen conflict that play to Putin's hands. But if you stabilize, if we can get past the war and secure a free Ukraine, they are going to be poised for rapid economic growth. A lot of them are looking at Poland, and they're thinking, we're as smart as the Poles. The Poles triple their GDP in one generation. Why can't we do that? You can sense it, this latent demand for a country worthy of their sacrifice. So that's not that's hardly low-hanging fruit, but it's an issue with upside potential. And for anybody who thinks it's impossible, I'm so old that I remember when Poland's economic transformation was regarded as impossible by all the smart people in Washington. So, yeah, I don't know what Yermak said yesterday. I couldn't go to that meeting. But you can construct plausible scenarios for real progress on some key issues. And Putin Putin may see his way to victory. We get tired, the Ukrainians collapse. I get all that. But I also remember when it was a matter of when strategic pessimism in the 1970s and the 1980s showed that we were losing the Cold War. And that was right through the mid-1980s. I mean, come on, guys, wake up. So, you know, as a policy person, I have to think about the opportunities. Because if you're an analyst and you think of the pessimism, you know, go bring it to the table in the Situation Room, you know, put it there like a stink bomb. But the policy people have to look for the opportunities, and sometimes they are there.
Mm-hmm. Liana, same question to you. You know, Global South, one question just to throw out there, you know, new Washington consensus, Ukraine, or anything else?
I think we underestimate the opportunities that are in Russia's neighborhood, if one still wants to call it that way, apart from Ukraine. So what we see is that because of the war against Ukraine, Russia is entirely losing its regional clout. I mean, it is losing its support in its neighborhood in Central Asia, in South Caucasus. It's losing the power positions that it had there. And I find it surprising, that's certainly not a low-hanging fruit, but I find it surprising that we are not using these opportunities not only to increase our own influence in Central Asia, in the South Caucasus, instead of leaving this to Turkey and China to move in. And I think Nagorno-Karabakh has been an example where we have not used our influence at all to prevent the terrible situation there. But we should, because it adds sort of, it plays into two of our goals. It weakens Russia further. Why should we not take advantage of Russian weakness and of Russian military weakness? And it is a time when those countries are actually looking for balancing away from Russia, for certain signals where they can sort of demonstrate that they are a little bit more independent from Russia. So I think that's something where we don't have a strategic approach right now, given the power vacuum that in some parts of Russia's neighborhood will be there because of Russia's weakened position. And I'm also thinking about Moldova. I mean, for Moldova, we have a real opportunity there, not only with EU accession, but also with Transnistria being a conflict where Russian troops are isolated in Transnistria right now, right? So, I mean, why don't we invest more in this to weaken Russia, but also to increase our own hold in the region? I think that's one of the opportunities that we don't see, perhaps out of risk of provoking further Russian escalation. If we do so, I think we should certainly be aware of those risks. But these are foods to pick, because there's little that Russia can do at the moment to prevent this kind of stronger posturing of the West in Russia's neighborhood.
Peter?
Yeah, I think there are opportunities created by Russia being thrown off balance in the former Soviet Union states and the Arctic Council. Really, from Istanbul to Xinjiang, there's a Turkic zone that where the U.S. can support at least the NATO ally Turkey over Chinese influence. And then, you know, I think the era of trying to wedge China and Russia are essentially over. I mean, I think that animating thought, which existed in part in the Trump administration, in part in the Biden administration, really died on February 24th, 2022. So we might as well use Chinese and Russian or Sino-Russian proximity as a way to pull our allies closer into alignment. I was just recently in Europe, and I was watching ZDF, the major German broadcaster, and prior to the war, they would have documentaries on China as this fascinating place of economic growth and the bullet trains that come on time and this sort of veneer of efficiency. And this documentary had sort of the dark mood background and strategic dependencies and all the rest that really showed, I think, an awareness in Germany, but I think in other parts of Europe about the risks of a Nord Stream 2 style relationship with the Chinese. And so this isn't, I think, any earth-shattering recommendation, but we should be pushing aggressively on things like critical minerals to build a common European-American relationship and front to get away from our vulnerability on Chinese goods and the Chinese writ large. And I think as the WTO is something of a walking zombie at this point, rethink the entire structure of international trade the best we can. And the US and the EU, I think, probably recognize the value of each other more and more ever since the full-scale invasion. So those would be some of my pleas. But I think direct tactical moves like, how many defense customers are enamored by Russian military goods, or at least more so than they were on February 24th. The Russian military is going to be first in line to rebuild their own kit. Some of these weapon systems have not performed. I would have liked to have seen when Prigozhin was marching on Moscow, the White House put out just sort of a subtle leak to the press about Modi and Biden having talked about defense sales, or a Central Asia plus U.S. summit, or just ideas to kind of put pressure on the Russians and show that we're competing. We're not just bloodless technocrats, but we understand that this is kind of a law of the jungle, and we're ready to compete with the Russians. And where they have vulnerabilities, when you have your boot on somebody's throat, you shouldn't just pull off for the sake of stability, but try to really make inroads in these places. So with that very nasty conclusion, I'll kick it back to Damir.
Well, we have a little bit more time. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience like to pose to our panel after that grim thing.
Yeah.
Oh, it's not grim. I mean, it's statecraft. Is a polite way to
Thank you,
put it.
Ambassador. Yeah.
Any questions here? Yeah, please.
I heard several references to minerals and also the areas C5+1. Is there a vision or a thought around what a C5+1 agreement with Europe and NATO would look like? Maybe something on the order of deep and comprehensive free trade agreement or something of this nature? Just throwing it out there. Curious.
Any minerals experts on the Peter?
Well, I mean, just because he ended on trade, this is probably an elephant in the room which we didn't address. I don't see a huge appetite in Europe or the U.S. for big free trade initiatives at this moment across the Atlantic. Every once in a while, there is amongst the lead epistemic communities talk of the importance of a free trade deal, and we couldn't even get one across the finish line with our special relationship with the UK post-Brexit. So I'm hard-pressed to think that we can actually get one with Europeans. Look at the experience the Europeans are having with Mercosur, with the CETA agreement. Took a lot of pain and suffering. And on our side, if we just look back to 2016, the 4 finalists, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump, all at least openly rejected both TTIP and TTPs. Now, who's to say if that's actually how it would have gone had Hillary Clinton won the White House? But nonetheless, it's telling that that was at least the public posture at the time. So I don't think there's free trade in the cards. But, just as there isn't going to be a Doha round, we should try to at least think about plurilateral arrangements, how to build with all due respect, a free world sort of trading system that gets us away from these challenges. And I'm all for moving as aggressively into Central Asia as possible in ways to build ties, build relations, and bypass and get past the stranglehold that Russia and China have on both the minerals and the big carbon kind of energy.
Tara, Liana, do you want to chime in on free trade and the likelihood of trade coming back, given that the EU is a free trade bloc ultimately? How do you square that sort of future?
I mean, I think for Europeans, they're in a very difficult position right now, right? Because there's an inner European fight between the French, between the Commission, between the Germans about how protectionist Europe should become itself. But then it's also difficult for the European Union to accept that the United States has shifted its approach and that it doesn't really care about the WTO anymore. And that in the IRA, Europe was, there are 3 reasons why there was this mess up about the IRA. The first is that no one knew that the European Union is not a free trade agreement partner for the US. The other is that no one cared about that fact and pushed the IRA through. And the third is that, it was just not relevant enough. And all 3 options are sort of not particularly pleasing for Europeans, not particularly charming if Europe sees itself still as sort of one of the most important partners of the United States. So I think it's for Europe also a homework to get to adapt to the new reality, because that will not change whatever the outcome of November 2024 will be, right? I mean, it is not a coincidence that many of Biden's policies on trade continue Trump policies. So if there's one continuity that we can see in these administrations, it is the trade continuity, something that Europeans have to prepare for now, instead of clinging sort of to old beliefs that might be noble in principle, but is not what the US is looking for.
We're all circling around international economic system which addresses the problem of monopolies and high ground occupied by authoritarian countries. Extrapolate from the Chinese use of key raw materials, rare earths, or the Russian use of natural gas as a weapon. I can't tell you how many lectures I got in Europe about how the Russians would never use gas as a weapon. It was an article of faith. Oh yeah, oh well. But abstract from this, what does that mean for a system? It's true that free trade, there's no political appetite for a free trade agreement. But what is there an appetite for? How do we do this? And I think the US and EU are actually well positioned to start having these discussions. We haven't figured out the right mix of policy tools, and shameless plug, y'all come tomorrow morning and you'll see, you'll listen to a panel diving into these issues. I'm not on it, so you're safe. But this is something that the Biden people have been trying to address, and they haven't landed it. But there's a common approach. There's a potential bipartisan consensus in Washington along these lines, and I think there's a potential transatlantic consensus. We're not there yet. It's not low-hanging fruit. It's complicated stuff. But we're not quite at loggerheads. Yeah, we've had bumps in the road, and I think the Biden people didn't quite realize how the IRA was going to hit the Europeans. But it's not quite crude protectionism, which is the accusation you hear in Europe. It's more sophisticated. There's room there. Anyway, I am not an expert in these areas, but I've worked on it a little bit. There's room for to build a transatlantic consensus at the next level on trade, investment issues, sanctions issues, technology control issues, and we're being forced into it because the Chinese and Russians have put various guns to our heads, and we're responding.
Tara, you see our clock.
I
Do you
do.
have any final remarks for us?
Very quickly, I think it's conventional wisdom to say that when Russia invaded Ukraine, it was a strategic awakening for Europe. I think the strategic awakening actually happened during COVID. And at a moment where China started to weaponize its dependency on trade with the EU, and the EU, which always had believed that, yes, it was a free trade zone and that it was for openness in the world, particularly in trade, realized that it might have to build a number of instruments to protect itself because it had interest. And so I think we're moving towards this now a little bit more.
Perfect timing. Amazing, amazing. Anyway, a round of applause for our panelists here. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I please ask you to stay in your seats. We have some remarks from Congressman Moran ahead of a reception we'll be hosting for veterans outside. Please join us tomorrow at 9 a.m. for day 2, starting with U.S. Deputy Secretary of Commerce will be here. And please go to the Atlantic Council website for more information, and hope to see you all tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
You know, Peter, what Yermak discussed with the National Security Advisor?
Congressman, absolutely fantastic to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time. I know it's one more boring day in the House. A few votes coming up, so I know your time is also tight. Dear friends, Congressman Moran is, of course, from the great, proud state of Texas. Those of you who've been at the EU residence in D.C., my home, know that my living room is filled with art from Texas, from the San Angelo Museum of Fine Arts, for that matter. Supremely proud of that connection, cultural connection between Texas and Europe that we've built. You may or may not know that the congressman was for 2 years at West Point before he moved to Texas Tech, which you may be surprised to know I've been to. Texas Tech, not West Point, but Texas Tech. It's an absolutely stunning, beautiful, beautiful place. I had friends from Greece, friends of theirs studying in the early 80s. And of course, he is the co-chair of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. Now, this is the regular format we have for discussions between the European Parliament and the U.S. Congress on all the main challenges that we face. And boy, are we facing challenges. Ukraine, Middle East, dealing with the challenges of new technologies on our democracies, on our innovation, a little competition with small countries like China or others around the world. So, Congressman, it's fantastic to have you with us, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be here today with you all, and especially as we're talking about celebrating veterans. I know that's really the topic around which I was asked to be here. I know you're going to have a veterans reception, and I want to focus my comments on that. But I want to say thanks to the Ambassador for that introduction. Thanks also to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event and for the reception in honor of Veterans Day. Thanks to each one of you for your diplomatic efforts, for your efforts in your own countries to make sure that we have a world that's peaceful, that's stable, that's prosperous, that's free. That's the kind of thing that we want. So I want to talk a little bit about where I think we get there through our veterans and why we've gotten there through our veterans and the great camaraderie we've had between the EU and the United States for so many years, because it is indelibly important, not just to the present day, but to our future as well. Let me ask, is this clock a hard stop, whoever's telling me? Because I'm going to go past this time, I can tell you. All right, good. Because I was looking at that clock thinking, there's no way I'm going to say the things I want to be able to say in that amount of time. Do have votes coming up here in just a moment. Again, thank you, Ambassador, for your leadership in so many different areas, because it is these relationships that we have that we're building stronger and stronger every day. They're going to help us get through some very tough times. So let me talk about veterans themselves. I want to talk a little bit about how I define veterans and how we are reliant on veterans to keep us peaceful and stable and prosperous in this world. So how do I define a veteran? Well, to me, a veteran is an ordinary man or woman, and I'm going to tell you, I wrote almost every word of these. 90% of these words are mine because it's important to me talking about this issue. But I define it this way: ordinary men and women who do extraordinary things for their countries because they hear and they heed the call to serve. They don't hesitate. They don't make excuses. They do not quit until the mission is absolutely done. That's what a veteran is. They're heroes. We should honor them as heroes. Whether or not they gave all or some, it doesn't matter. It's only because of them that our shared values between the EU and the United States, those values of liberty and democracy, remain intact. But it's not just what they do, and this is one of the important things I want to tell you. This is very true. I want you to hear this. It's not just what they do, it's how they do it, right? It's not just what we do as nations, it's how we behave as nations. It is not just the what, it's the how and the why that is so important for us today. Because there are so many around this world that would be motivated by things that are immoral or things that are so unimportant that go away day after day. We don't want to be that. We want to take the long view. We want to take the moral view. We want to always be not just doing right, we want to be doing it in the right way. If you've not thought about it, service and sacrifice go hand in hand. It's something I talked to my veterans about this past weekend, and it's something that each one of you in your areas of service have recognized, I'm sure, that sacrifice comes along with it. Sometimes that sacrifice comes in the realm of your family sacrificing, your kids sacrificing, sacrificing money. I bet you there's a lot of people in this room today that are making less money today than they could in a different sector. Why? Because you wanted to serve. Sacrifice for our veterans came in a lot of different forms as well. Came in the forms of physical, mental, and emotional toll, not just in those times of service and those dates of service where they actually served on their DD-214. That's that military form that says when you started, when you ended. But it's the times before and after, and especially after for the rest of their life. So we have to honor that service.
Washington, and the other is of General Lafayette, right? Now, you think that's strange. The United States has a huge portrait of a French general. That's because of all he did for us, his heroism on the battlefield, his diplomatic efforts, his ardent support of U.S. constitutional principles way back before we were even a nation. So we honor him even today. What's more, as you walk through the halls of the United States Congress, you're going to notice that there are several busts of defenders of freedom that are from other nations. Busts including the likes of Czech Republic's Václav Havel, Sweden's Raoul Wallenberg, heroes of freedom from around this world. We honor them by having their busts in the United States Capitol because we say we are inextricably intertwined. The goals that we have for each of our nations and collectively for this world are the same. But those goals are upheld only because of the sacrifices of our veterans. Since the conclusion of World War II, the alliances of the Atlantic nations have consistently worked together to oppose totalitarianism, imperialism, oppression, and terror. We've worked to ensure the rule of law, democratic institutions, and individual liberties are upheld. That's what's important to all of us today. We may have differences of opinion about a thing or two from time to time, and that's fine. I'm a Texas Tech Red Raider. I love rooting for my Texas Tech Red Raiders. You should root for your country. You absolutely should. But you know what? There's days when I say, I'm just going to enjoy a great day of college football, and I'll root for the Texas Longhorns from day to day. Absolutely. Every now and then, maybe even root for the Texas Aggies. Maybe root for the Texas A&M Aggies. I'm kidding. But you understand what I'm saying. No, I really will. I'll root for the Aggies. But you understand what I'm saying. I mean, there is a part of us that has to be looking out for the interests of our nations. But together, we've got these collective interests that are the same, and they're parallel, and they're stronger if we're acting together. As a testament to our interconnectedness, the interconnectedness of our nations and the common blood spilled by our veterans, many of our veterans, our U.S. veterans, have final resting places in Europe. You may not know that there are about almost 90,000 American soldiers that are buried in cemeteries in 13 different cemeteries across Europe. Even in Arlington Cemetery, there's a final resting place for a number of veterans from EU countries like France, Germany, Greece, Italy, and the Netherlands. Folks that have spilled blood together, and oftentimes, as I was looking at that and reading through the history of how that happened, oftentimes the ones that are buried here in Arlington Cemetery are buried together, EU remains and American remains, because they died at the same time in the same incident, fighting together, side by side, for freedom and liberty in this world. That's something we shouldn't forget. These veterans are blood brothers. I want you to listen to this next paragraph, because this is something that was meaningful to me when I wrote it. These veterans are blood brothers, and we are bound by their blood covenant to honor their sacrifice by standing firmly together as members of our respective parliamentary bodies, as diplomats, as policymakers, and as statesmen to work toward a world that has greater peace, stability, prosperity, and opportunity. To do what is right, peaceably when possible, forcibly when necessary. We want to avoid using that force. That's why many of us are engaged in foreign affairs, diplomacy, economic diplomacy. We do not want to see war come. We don't. But we have to be ready, standing together firmly when it does. And for those veterans in this room, you were there for us when it came. Proudly, our alliance grows. As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of NATO, I'm encouraged by its expansion to include Finland in 2023 and hopefully the 32nd NATO ally, Sweden, soon. Would love to see that happen. In conclusion, I want to just challenge you in your own personal life. I'm glad the clock's gone. That makes me feel better. I want to challenge you in your personal life and hopefully have you reflect a little bit on this Veterans Day weekend. By talking about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, I want to point out 3 things that were heart-stopping for me. When I heard the story about the design of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and I went down there on Memorial Day, the weekend before, and a number of members of Congress, we washed that memorial with brushes and scrubs because it gets dust on it. If you'll notice, it's different than any other monument in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to talk about those differences here. 3 differences in particular I want you to take note of. One is that the folks listed on there are listed chronologically. The first death is listed in the middle on panel 1, and it goes all the way to the end and then comes back around and wraps around to the other side. And then the last death is listed on a panel that's right next door, right next to the first death. Well, the reason why those names are listed chronologically is because every name represents more than just a name. It's a moment when somebody gave everything. They sacrificed everything for the freedom that they were fighting for in that conflict. They gave everything to this nation in that. And you guys have experienced that same in your nations as well. Somebody gave everything. And the second thing that was important to note about in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is there's no rank, there's no gender, there's no race, there's no religion next to the names. It's just names. You want to know why? Because the sacrifice given by every one of those individuals had equal and eternal value. The general didn't give more that died. The private didn't give less. The sergeant didn't give the middle. No, they all gave all. They all gave everything. And their sacrifice was equal to the man and woman listed beside them. Third, here's the third thing I want you to remember about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I told you it was different than every other memorial in Washington, D.C. Why? Because everything else is white marble, isn't it? Everything in D.C. is white marble. This was not. It's black granite. Why was it made out of black granite? Well, if you go over there, and this is why we were washing that memorial before Memorial Day, if you stand in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and here's what I would challenge you is as you go back to your home countries and you stand at the memorials and look at those, when you look at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, that black granite, when washed and when clean, becomes a mirror. And you look at those names, and as you begin to look at those names, actually what you see is your reflection in that memorial. And you should be challenged at that moment when you see your reflection in that memorial, challenged about the service and the sacrifice that that person on that panel gave, and then challenged in your own life about what kind of service are you willing to give? What kind of sacrifice are you willing to make? If they were willing to give all to their country, to our country, for freedom's sake, what are we willing to give for our individual countries? What are we willing to give for the sake of peace and prosperity and stability and freedom and democracy and the rule of law in this world? No sacrifice that's going to be required of us will be greater than the sacrifice required of them in that moment. So that's my challenge. Look into the mirror, ask yourself, what am I willing to do to ensure that this world remains the world that we need it to be? How can we strengthen these partnerships? How can we look past our differences and stay focused on those things that are common between us? There's too much common ground between us for us to get divided over the things that separate us. With that challenge, I'm going to wish you Godspeed on your journey, and thank you for allowing me to be here today. Appreciate that.
This works. This, okay. Congressman, thank you very much. This was really inspiring, and I have to say, you wrote this yourself. It's pretty darn good. I mean, and if you, I'm sure you're comfortable with this job, but in the future you can do much bigger things in writing. Today, there's a new generation of veterans every day created in Ukraine. So I wanted to use this opportunity as well to thank you, to thank the U.S. Congress for working together with us Europeans in the past year and a half in a bipartisan way to provide massive support, unconditional support to the Ukrainians as they fight this battle. It was absolutely clear to us back in Europe and to you here, I know, that Putin was betting that he could outlast us, that he was betting that his big bag military machine would intimidate the Ukrainians, and it hasn't happened. The exact opposite has happened, so, and it's because of our support. So I look forward to continuing that support on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'll say one more thing. I hope in the end of this, after we have humiliated and intimidated the bully that is trying to rub our noses to the ground, who is convinced, Putin, that he can bend our will through violence to his own, after we do that, maybe we can turn to the Ukrainians fighting and dying in Ukraine and say, Ukrainians are not fighting like heroes, but heroes are fighting like Ukrainians, because I think that's what the legacy of these veterans is going to be. So thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.